Usually, waking up because you have to go to the bathroom is annoying, but on May 26, 2013, waking up and leaving his bunk to use the bathroom was a decision that saved 29-year-old Harrison Ojegba Okene's life. Through an odd twist of fate, Harrison ended up being the lone survivor of a boat sinking at sea. He can lay claim to a unique title. He's the only person in the world to have survived on the seafloor for nearly 3 days. The Gulf of Guinea in the southeast Atlantic Ocean is rich with petroleum-laden layers of sedimentary seabed. Many offshore oil rig drilling operations dot the African coast here. On May 26th, about 20 miles off of Escravos, Nigeria, in choppy seas, 3 tugboats pitched and yawed as they performed tension tow functions on a Chevron oil tanker filling up at single buoy mooring number 3. Just before 5 a.m., the tugboat Jascon 4 was caught by a large rogue wave and capsized. Because of ongoing piracy problems in the Gulf, security protocol on the tugboat was that the 12-man crew would lock themselves in their room when sleeping. Unfortunately, this rule slowed down the Jascon 4's crew when they tried to escape. The crew members had to first scramble out of their cabins, that is, except for the vessel's cook, Harrison, who had gotten up to use the bathroom in his underwear. When the tugboat keeled over and the ocean rushed in, Harrison had to force the bathroom's metal door open against the wall of water. The pressure of the water was extremely strong and Harrison was unable to follow some of his colleagues to the emergency hatch. He watched in horror as a surge overwhelmed 3 crew members and swept them out of the boat into the raging sea. Then the water pushed Harrison down a narrow hallway into another bathroom which adjoined an officer's cabin. Dazed and bruised but miraculously still alive, Harrison held onto an overturned wash basin to keep his head above water in the 4-foot square bathroom. The boat sank nearly 100 feet, eventually coming to rest upside down on the seabed. When the tugboat capsized, there was an immediate rescue operation launched with the other boats in the area and a helicopter. A diving crew quickly located the wreck and marked the location with buoys. They banged on the hull. Harrison hammered back, but they didn't hear him. As the divers weren't prepared for deep diving, they could only stay at the depth of the wreck for a limited period of time. The rescue was called off due to no evidence of survivors. After nearly a day of being in the bathroom, Harrison got up the courage to leave his little air pocket. In pitch darkness, he swam and felt his way into the engineer's office. Miraculously, there was another air pocket here too, of about 4 feet high in Harrison's estimation. Having solved the immediate problem of having air to breathe, Harrison could focus on other concerns. The first one being that he was cold. In May, the surface temperature of the East Atlantic on average is a pleasant 81.9 degrees Fahrenheit, but Harrison was 100 feet down. Shivering, wet, and wearing only boxer shorts, Harrison faced hypothermia, or his body losing heat faster than he could produce it. Cautiously, Harrison felt his way around the cabin. He found some tools and used them to strip off wall paneling. With a mattress and the material from the wall, he was able to make a platform to sit on. This platform helped Harrison to stay afloat and lifted the upper half of his body out of the water, allowing him to reduce heat loss. Hungry, thirsty, cold, and stuck in complete darkness, Harrison was terrified. He tried to think about his family. Quite religious, whenever he felt especially scared, Harrison would pray and call on Jesus to rescue him. Over time, the seawater began to remove the skin from Harrison's tongue. He could smell something rotting. He thought it was the decomposing bodies of his former shipmates. Every small sound in the dark was magnified. The creaking of the hull, the banging of the wreckage against the walls, and most horrifically, splashing and eating noises as fishes nibbled at corpses. Meanwhile, a dive support vessel, the Luek Toucan, arrived to the area of the sinking. The parent company of the Jascon 4, West African Ventures, had hired a deep-sea salvage saturation diving team from subsea services company DCN Global to retrieve the bodies of the lost crew members. The 6 divers, deck crew, and technical staff of the Luek Toucan knew it was going to be a grueling mission. Aside from the heart-rending work of recovering the dead, the boat had sunk upside down into soft mud, stirring up fine silt and creating extremely poor visibility. Furthermore, because of the security protocols, the boat was latched from the inside. Dive Team 2 consisted of Nico van Heerden, Andre Erasmus, and Daryl Oosthuizen, with Supervisor Colby Ware topside on the ship, helping to guide the divers via a connected microphone while watching the dive through a camera worn by Nico. The team spent over an hour breaking through an external watertight door and then a second metal door to get into the sunken boat. Once inside, it was extremely disorienting, with the ceiling being on the bottom and the floor overhead. The murky water was filled with all sorts of hazards, including furniture and equipment. Slowly, Painstakingly, the divers explored the boat. They'd recovered 4 corpses when Nico crawled up the stairs to the main deck. It was a tight squeeze with the diving gear on his back. He was in a small passageway getting his bearings when something suddenly reached out of the murk and touched him. Harrison had nearly given up hope when he had heard a noise that sounded like an anchor dropping. Then eventually he heard hammering on the hull of the boat. He knew it had to be divers. He banged on the wall but didn't think they heard him. Then Harrison saw the light from one of the divers' head torches as he swam through the hallway past the far end of the cabin. Unfortunately, the diver was too quick and left the area before Harrison could reach him. But then came the magical moment. You may have seen the surreal, amazing rescue footage from Nico's video when he sees what he believes is another dead body. He touches the corpse's hand, and the hand unexpectedly squeezes his. Nico has a momentary freak out as his supervisor Colby shouts through the microphone, "He's alive! He's alive!" Colby then tells Nico to comfort Harrison by patting him on the shoulder and giving him a thumbs up sign. The divers were amazed to find Harrison alive. The maximum depth for recreational diving is 130 feet. Generally, recreational divers don't stay at 100 feet for more than 20 minutes. In terms of the air pocket, the divers had reached Harrison just in time. A human inhales roughly 350 cubic feet of air every 24 hours. However, because the boat was under pressure on the ocean floor, scientists estimate that Harrison's air pocket had been compressed by a factor of about 4. If the pressurized air pocket were about 216 cubic feet, it would contain enough oxygen to keep Harrison alive for about 2.5 days. When Harrison was located, he had been underwater for about 60 hours. An additional danger came from the carbon monoxide or CO2 buildup. CO2 is fatal to humans at a concentration of about 5%. As Harrison breathed, he exhaled carbon dioxide, slowly increasing the levels of the gas in the tiny space. However, CO2 is absorbed by water, and by splashing the water inside his air pocket, Harrison inadvertently increased the water's surface area, thereby heightening the absorption of CO2 and helping to keep the gas below the lethal 5% level. The divers describe Harrison as having CO2 poisoning, being short of breath and delirious when they found him. He wouldn't have lasted much longer. The divers first used hot water to warm Harrison up, then fitted him with an oxygen mask. Meanwhile, on the surface, the dive support crew was in contact with medical and diving experts, discussing how to best help the survivor. Harrison had a new problem, what divers commonly call the bends. The bends, also known as decompression sickness or caisson disease, occurs when nitrogen bubbles form in the blood as a result of changes in pressure. If Harrison ascended directly from 100 feet underwater to the surface of the ocean, the bubbles in his blood would cause, in the best case, joint pain and rashes, to the worst case, paralysis, neurological issues, cardiac arrest, or possibly even death. It was decided that Harrison would be treated as if he were one of the saturation divers coming up after a dive. Harrison spent about 20 minutes getting used to breathing through the mask. Then the divers put a diving helmet and harness onto him. They were a little worried that he would panic as they got him out of the boat and would be a danger to the dive, but Harrison continued to be cool under pressure. The team was impressed with his level demeanor. Harrison was taken from the boat and led to a diving bell, which took him to the surface. He finally arrived topside at around 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the 28th of May. Disoriented, Harrison thought that it was Sunday evening and that he had only been trapped for 12 hours. He was shocked to learn that he'd been underwater for over 2 days. From the diving bell, Harrison was moved to a decompression chamber where he stayed for another 2.5 days while his body decompressed to surface pressure. Of the 12 crew members on board the tugboat Jascon 4, divers rescued 1 survivor and recovered 10 of the bodies. The search for the 11th crew member had to be called off due to dangerous conditions. Harrison made a full recovery from his ordeal and returned to his hometown of Warri, Nigeria. He didn't go to the funerals of his colleagues because he feared their families' reactions. Nigerians can be very religious, but are also superstitious. Some rumors spread that Harrison saved himself through black magic. Harrison was also plagued with survivor's guilt, wondering why he was the only one to live. Since the incident, Harrison's experienced PTSD. His wife, Akpavono Okene, says he suffers nightmares. Harrison will suddenly awake, screaming and flailing, convinced that he's underwater. Harrison has since taken a cooking job on dry land and vows to never again take a position on a boat. He made a pact with God when he was at the bottom of the ocean. "When I was under the water, I told God, if you rescue me, I will never go back to the sea again. Never." If you've already seen the 2008 movie Bronson, about Britain's so-called most notorious prisoner, don't worry. That rather theatrical piece of cinema didn't tell you much about the man, so there's so much more to see today. You might be thinking that it's coincidental that a man with such a reputation has the same name as a former Hollywood tough guy. but he wasn't called that at birth. The name was acquired during his bare-knuckle boxing days. He was actually born Michael Gordon Peterson. Yep, that doesn't sound quite as fearful. There's a lot of controversy about this man, regarding whether he should have been in prison for so long or if prison is to blame for his often crazy behavior. We discuss this and more in this episode of The Infographic Show, Britain's most notorious prisoner, Charles Bronson. As you know, he was born with the name Michael. His birthday was December 6, 1952. He spent his first few years in Wales and then moved to Luton, which isn't too far away from the capital, London. It doesn't seem that he came from a rough-and-tumble background, given that his father ran a conservative club for a while and his aunt and uncle were a mayor and mayoress. His aunt actually once said this about him: as a boy, he was a lovely lad. He was obviously bright and always good with children. He was gentle and mild-mannered, never a bully. He would defend the weak. He might have defended the weak, but it seems his penchant for violence and crime started early in life. After he moved up north at the age of 13, it seems that that's when trouble started. At that age, he was charged as a juvenile for stealing, and it said he was part of a gang. He didn't much enjoy school and soon left to start working at an early age. His first job came when he moved back down to Luton. This was a very short 2-week stint working in Tesco supermarket. Apparently, he was fired for attacking his manager. After this, it seems, crime became second nature to young Michael. He got in trouble for criminal damage but got off with a fine and some probation. He had lots of jobs, mostly related to labor or factory work, and we're told he enjoyed nothing more than a good night out on the town, drinking gallons of beer and getting into fistfights with the locals. Easy to do in some areas of the UK. He likely wasn't short of foes on the mean streets of Luton. One of his jobs, we're told, was a circus strongman, so he was likely a hard man to fight. He got in trouble again after crashing a stolen lorry, or a truck, into another car, but again got off with just a fine as no one was seriously hurt. At this point, he is still in his teens. Yet again, he got into trouble, and at this time aged 19, when he was involved in a smash and grab, which is basically smashing a car into a shop front and getting as much as you can. Again, he got off with just a fine and a suspended sentence. Age 20 perhaps, he got his chance to join what is sometimes called the straight and narrow, as he met a girl and got married. But apparently she quite liked his tough guy persona, his tailored suits, and the fact that he spoke in a Cockney accent. They had a child and called him Michael Jonathan Peterson. According to the British press, the son is very private and has never spoken publicly about his notorious dad, so we can't tell you much about him. Moving on, now 22, Michael was arrested for armed robbery, and at this time the judge came down hard. He got 7 years, but prison wasn't exactly a place he liked being, it seemed. During his first stint in prison in Liverpool, he attacked 2 other prisoners, and we're told he wasn't provoked. That got him time in solitary, something he would see much more of later. He was then transferred to prison in Hull, and again had issues with guards and prisoners. They gave him sedatives to calm him down, which apparently made him very ill. He also spent more time in isolation. He was said to be a very difficult prisoner. On one occasion, he was out of solitary, he attacked a prisoner with a glass jug, and he was convicted of unlawful wounding. Yet again, he was moved, this time to the tough Armley Jail in Leeds, a foreboding-looking place if you've ever seen one. So there he was, now serving time in what looks like a medieval castle. Even in 2018, the place is said to be the place with the highest rate of people taking their own lives. And in the press right now, it's said it's still very much an unsafe place for both prisoners and staff. Back in the 70s, it can't have been a holiday. But it seems he was too much for Armley, and he kept moving between a number of prisons, sometimes chained to the floor of the vans he traveled in. It's said if not in solitary, he would attack prisoners and guards. It's also said he incurred numerous vicious beatings from the guards after an attack. You might have seen that in the movie, which depicts these guards having to tackle him in numbers. During one time in solitary while recovering from a beating, he got divorced. We imagine this might have been a low point, but it's said that one thing that kept him going was his solitary workout routine, keeping him healthy and fearsome. His book, Solitary Fitness, which he wrote after many years inside, has sold millions of copies. Reviews are actually very positive, although people talk about how strange the book can get at times. Profits from the book, says the media, go to children's charities. The British press tells us that his strength was quite unbelievable. He once bent the cell bars with his own hands, and it's said he holds 6 world records for strength and fitness. Another unofficial record he has set is the most prison rooftop protests by any British inmates. But right now, we're still in the 70s and a long way from fame or infamy. While in prison in London, he tried to poison an inmate, and it seems that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Enough with prison, he was transferred to a psychiatric facility. But guess who he met there? Two of Britain's most ruthless gangsters, the Kray twins. He called them the best two guys I ever met. That friendship didn't last long though, as he was moved back to prison. What followed was more solitary, escape attempts, attacks on prisoners that ended with lifelong scars, more attacks, and finally, when the authorities were sick and tired, he was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He was no longer just a criminal, but mentally ill. In 1978, he was again in another special facility, but it seems he didn't much like being forced to take medication, and wasn't keen on the fact that he was surrounded by some of Britain's most disturbed people. Men who would never leave the facility because they had done things to people we will not talk about. Yep, he didn't like some of these terrible men, and at one point was said to be about 5 seconds away from killing a fellow patient or prisoner who had taken the life of an innocent child. In his own words, describing the people around him at the facility, "I witnessed them running into walls, using their heads as rams. I've seen them fall unconscious doing this. There was one who just kept trying to eat himself, biting his arms, legs, and feet. He tried to kill another prisoner, and then in 1982, when still in the notorious Broadmoor, he led a rooftop protest that lasted 3 days and caused around $300,000 worth of damage. Now you can see why this guy became well known as a hard-to-deal-with prisoner. But there was a lot more to come. He hadn't even started. He led 2 more rooftop protests and also went on a hunger strike, but in some ways he found solace in writing poems, sketching, and creating cartoon strips. He even won awards for his work. It didn't stop him being violent though, just settled him down from time to time. Psychiatrists couldn't figure him out, and even though he was in a mental facility, he was never properly diagnosed. He once said, "Asylums are crazy places with crazy rules. If you're not mad when you arrive, you are when you leave." Again, he was moved from facility to prison, stabbing inmates, hitting others. More rooftop protests, more isolation, more beatings from the guards, more medicine, and perhaps his piece de resistance, he once strangled a prison governor. After that, he was not allowed out of isolation until he finished his sentence. He got out of prison in 1987 and almost immediately turned to crime. Although his first offense was quite comical, he bought a water pistol and modified it a bit, after which he forced a man at Water Pistol Point to drive him to Luton, his favorite spot. There, he started bare-knuckle fighting and earned the nickname Charles Bronson. He actually legally changed his name to this. Was this the start of a life on the outside? Not a chance. It's written that he would fight anyone and even challenge the king of bare-knuckle fighting, Lenny McLean. It seems Lenny wanted no part of him, or at least when he agreed to fight, it was too late as Bronson was back in prison. In another fight, he was challenged to go against a large Rottweiler. He killed it and said later in life that he really regretted that. It was cash in hand though. He was only out of prison months and was back inside again for armed robbery. We won't go into details, but he fought again, attacked prisoners, guards, and had more time in solitary, was moved and moved and moved, and occasionally tried to start riots. In 1989, he was attacked himself, stabbed in the back several times, but he recovered. He wouldn't tell the police anything about his attackers. In 1992, he got out for the grand total of 53 days. He was jailed but got off. Then he was arrested again for having a shotgun and conspiracy to rob. It gets crazy here, because while on the remand, he took a librarian as a hostage. While negotiating with police, he had 3 demands: an inflatable doll, a helicopter, and a cup of tea. Yep, you heard that right. He was given 8 years despite saying the gun was to blow off his own head. It wasn't the first time he had contemplated taking his own life. He was difficult again, transferred from prisons, and at times was left naked for many days on end in dark isolation. At one point, he was put in the worst spot in any prison in the UK, something called the Hannibal Cage, that had been created for another prisoner who had once killed inmates and was said to have spooned out one person's brain and eaten it. Even though at one point he attacked a governor, it's said he got much better after being allowed to interact with handicapped children. He also kept up his cartoon sketching. These were the quiet times. They didn't last long. He endured more solitary, more moves, and then in one prison he took 2 Iraqi hijackers as hostage in his cell. It's said he was going crazy after losing his father. It's also said that he told the guards if they came close he would snap off the heads of his hostages. He made his hostages tickle his feet and demanded they sing songs to him. To them, he was known as the General. He demanded a plane, machine guns, ammunition, and a cheese and pickle sandwich. It seems later he just kept asking for ice cream. In the end, he let the hostages go and another 7 years were added to his sentence. While in great physical shape, it's said that all the time in darkness and solitary had negative effects on his eyes and his social skills, and lawyers now started to get on his side. It's a pity then that he took one of them hostage. He let him go quickly though, but after one civilian worker criticized his drawings, he took him hostage too, and then started ripping up parts of the prison. What else? Well, after the millennium, he got married again, converted to Islam, changed his name and took another hostage, wrote a book, sketched a lot, and then changed his name to Charles Arthur Charlie Salvador, out of respect for his favorite artist. The movie came out and he became a household name. Until then, not many people knew about him. Thousands of people around the world started to support him, saying even though he had been a bad boy, his incarceration had just gone on too long. But he couldn't stop messing up. In 2014, he attacked another governor. That same year, his artwork went up for auction, and his 200 pieces, often dark in nature, fetched around £30,000. Bronson donated a large part of this to the brain tumor charity and Keach Hospice in Luton. Bronson said the old him was now dead, and he was born again as the artist Salvador. He created more works too, donating to other charities and one-time Oxford's homeless. He also got married to an actress in 2017, and she's hoping to see him out soon. In total, out of the 44-plus years he served, 36 of them have been in solitary confinement, sometimes without light. In 2018, it was said that he is in open prison, but will have his case reviewed in 2 years and could get out. That might not happen though, as he's got a life sentence for one of his kidnappings. That was a teacher in 1999 that he held for 2 days. The British media reports that he allegedly smothered himself in butter, age 65, and challenged the guards to a fight. We'll leave you with something he once said. "I'm a nice guy, but sometimes I lose all my senses and become nasty. That doesn't make me evil, just confused." Trees, growers of fruits, spices, and nuts, generators of shade, home to birds, squirrels, koalas, frontline soldiers in the fight against climate change? You bet! Today we're doing something a little different and talking about TeamTrees.org's mission of planting 20 million new trees by 2020, where every donation of $1 equals 1 tree. You might be asking yourself, what would planting 20 million new trees do for the planet? Let's take a look at just how huge an impact each donation on Team Trees will make. A wide variety of organisms from lichen to bees to possums call trees home, and just one single mature oak tree can be home to as many as 500 different species. The Earth is rapidly losing species. We're in the middle of a mass extinction, and without trees for them to call home, many more animals will be at risk for extinction. Many animals require trees as a place to live, to feed, and to provide protection, so planting just one tree is like building a house, feeder, and nursery all at once. Donating $20 to plant 20 trees is like building an entire animal city. Multiply that by 1 million and we're talking about a super metropolis of biodiverse animal life. Study after study shows that spending time in a grove of trees or forest can provide emotional rejuvenation. It can improve your mood, create a sense of peace while reducing stress, depression, and anger. The Japanese even have a word for this, Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. The effect of trees is not only emotional but physical. Studies have shown that being among trees reduces blood pressure as well as lessens stress-related hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. So basically, trees make you happy. Plenty of scientific research has shown that happier people commit less crimes, especially violent ones. We think a grove of even just a few trees would be pretty nice. 20 million new trees would mean potentially thousands of new groves, which means millions of people able to take regular forest baths, increasing happiness and reducing crime. You'd be a regular crime fighter all thanks to the trees you helped plant. Trees reduce air temperature through blocking sunlight and creating shade. Trees also help it cool by reflecting heat upwards from their leaves. Further cooling occurs when moisture evaporates from the surface of the leaves, just like the way your body cools down by sweating. Trees can cool down an area by a lot. And we're not talking just a couple of degrees. Urban neighborhoods with mature trees can be up to 11 degrees cooler in summer heat than neighborhoods without trees. Just think about the difference between a miserably hot 90-degree day and a warm, comfortable 79 degrees. Trees can also cool down buildings, limiting the need for air conditioning, which has the added benefit of helping to conserve energy. Studies have shown that shade from strategically planted trees can reduce the air conditioning costs of buildings by 20% to 30%. Just think, if an average home has a cooling power bill of around $100 per month in the summer, and if 10 trees were planted around that same house, then 30% could be saved. And that means 20 million trees planted around homes could save $60 million in energy costs. So if you can't donate to this particular cause, please consider planting a few trees around your house. Not only will they be a beautiful addition, but they might even save your future self some money on your power bill. Trees are ideal for use as sound barriers because they reduce sound in two ways. First, they absorb the sound, since thick branches and leaves are great at absorbing high-frequency noise. Secondly, trees deflect sound. When a sound hits a rigid material, it bounces back. When a sound hits flexible material such as branches, the material vibrates and the sound is transformed into other forms of energy. A thick row of trees can block as much as 15 decibels of sound. That's almost like wearing a pair of earplugs, but you have something beautiful to look at instead of uncomfortable foam in your ears. The root system of trees holds soil in place during heavy rainstorms, preventing erosion, flooding, and mudslides, keeping people and buildings safe. Trees improve water quality too, as their root systems help to filter impurities and retain water within the soil. This allows for water tables to be recharged, with less water ultimately ending up in sewers and diminishing the amount of stormwater carrying pollutants to the ocean. A single 100-foot-tall tree can take as much as 11,000 gallons of water out of the soil during its growing season, releasing the water as healthy oxygen and clean water vapor. That means 20 million trees could filter a staggering 220 billion gallons. That's enough to fill more than 300,000 Olympic swimming pools. Humans inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Trees do exactly the opposite by absorbing and storing carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, which produces and releases oxygen as a byproduct. Excess carbon dioxide is building up in our atmosphere, strengthening the greenhouse effect and contributing to global warming. The more trees the Earth has, the more carbon dioxide is absorbed and mitigated. The amount of oxygen produced by a tree depends on several factors, including the species of tree, its health, and the ambient temperature. However, some typical calculations are that a single mature tree can absorb carbon dioxide at a rate of 48 pounds per year and release enough oxygen back into the atmosphere to support 2 humans. 1 acre of trees annually consumes the same amount of carbon dioxide equivalent to driving an average car for 26,000 miles. If we assume that an acre has roughly 300 trees, then 20 million new trees could consume the carbon dioxide equivalent of a new car driving over 1.7 billion miles annually. Last but not least, in addition to carbon dioxide, trees absorb other potentially harmful pollutants, such as sulfur dioxide and carbon monoxide. The canopies of trees act as a physical filter, trapping particulates of dust, pollen, smoke, and smog. A single mature tree removes up to 2.2 pounds every year, which means 20 million could remove up to 44 million pounds. And that's not all. Studies have also shown that the dust level in the air can be as much as 75% lower on the sheltered side of a tree as compared to the windward side. No one, and we mean no one, likes dust in the air. So do yourself and your neighbors a favor and plant some trees, or donate a few dollars to teamtrees.org and clean the air for yourself and generations to come. In July of 2019, a Swiss study stated that if we plant enough trees, we can stop or at least put a serious dent in climate change, which is why we're committed to helping TeamTrees.org's mission to plant 20 million new trees by 2020. The infographic show is getting involved, and you should too. Every donation of $1 equals a new tree planted. So become part of something huge with real benefits, and show the world that the YouTube community can come together and do something incredible. So what are you waiting for? Get out there and be part of the movement to plant 20 million new trees by going to teamtrees.org. And if you can't donate yourself, share this and other videos, and let's get your mom, dad, aunt, best friend, and everyone else involved. So there they are, Aiden and Ellie, the only survivors to have not succumbed to the apocalypse. Still in their late teens, the two are in their prime, at least when it comes to baby making. The good news is they have the hots for each other, but can they repopulate the Earth? You all know that there's a version of human history that involves two folks getting it on and kicking off mankind. Those two starstruck lovers were Adam and Eve. a couple that made the Garden of Eden their home. We're not exactly sure what kind of food they had to sustain their lives in the garden, but probably a bit more than the forbidden fruit. As for Aiden and Ellie, there's plenty of food on their lonely planet. The old blue ball didn't get whacked by an asteroid or anything similarly cataclysmic. It was forward-thinking artificial intelligence that wiped everything out. But then it destroyed itself just before it could finish off the last 2 humans. The animals are still around. The AI was programmed to ensure the sustainability of the Earth at any cost. And then it figured out that humans were going to destroy the planet. So the only rational thing to do was to destroy all the humans. Yeah, whoever developed that program sure upset a lot of folks. For the first couple of months, Aiden and Ellie didn't really think much about starting mankind again. They spent much of their time hanging out in rich people's houses and driving fast cars. Ellie almost drove into a tree one day, and after that the couple decided not to take too many risks. There was some serious business to take care of. Thankfully, they lived in Los Angeles, California, which, having a mild climate, meant the couple didn't have anything to fear from a brutal winter and the fact that there was no electricity. Let's just start by saying that while the apocalypse was a bit of a downer, these two got very lucky in terms of their chances of survival. They also had the added bonus of not being related. That's a good thing, because studies have shown that when children are born from folks who are related, there's a higher rate of infant mortality. Even if the kids did survive, there's a much higher chance that those kids will be born with some kind of defect. Nonetheless, Ellie and Aiden's offspring might be born healthy, but what about the offspring's offspring? Now we run into difficulties. In a study undertaken in Czechoslovakia between the years of 1933 and 1970, scientists looked at the children of parents who were first-degree relatives. First-degree is someone in your direct family. Procreating with these people isn't generally a cool thing to do. Even if first cousins get it on, the offspring has double the chance of having a birth defect. In that study, the kids who were born to first-degree parents didn't have great outcomes. 40% of them had very severe disabilities, 14% of them died because of their disabilities. We have a very good real-life example of this, featuring a man you might think was trying to increase the population of his country. That man was King Chulalongkorn of Thailand, who ruled from 1868 to 1910. The guy did a lot of good things in terms of modernizing his country, and he was also a formidable baby maker, just as his father had been. That father was King Mongkut, who had 82 children in total. One of them was Chulalongkorn. Following in his daddy's footsteps, Chulalongkorn had a lot of wives, consorts, and concubines, adding up to 116 women in total. To keep the bloodline pure, several of his partners, with whom he'd had children, were actually his half-sisters. Back in those days, it still wasn't clear how bad inbreeding was. But the proof soon became evident in the pudding, so to speak. He had a kid with his half-sister, named Daksinajar Nuradhirajbutri. It died just hours after it was born. He had 8 kids with his half-sister Savang Vadhana. One of them lived for just 3 days, and most of them didn't make it to adulthood. Vadhana herself lived until the ripe old age of 93. She was the product of inbreeding. In fact, if you research what happened to his 77 children, you see that many, and we're talking many, didn't live very long at all. A lot of them died when they were barely out of their fancy infant clothes. Many others died in their 20s and 30s. European royalty was also into keeping things in the family to ensure the bloodline was pure, and also to make certain money and property stay within the family after someone passed away. European inbreeding in royal families was very evident in the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Offspring were often weak and sickly. There was also the now famous deformity called the Habsburg jaw. The internet might have been down in Aiden and Ellie's brave new world, but they did have access to books and libraries, and being the prudent folks they were, they read up on inbreeding. After going through a few books on the matter, they were rightfully afraid their kids' would bite the dust just as soon as they let out that first primal scream, or perhaps spend their short lives hobbling around while carrying a jaw that would put Desperate Dan to shame. The couple also read about the Colt family in Australia and the marriage between June and Jim. In short, June was the child of a brother and a sister. She married Jim Colt. They were in New Zealand at the time. They had 7 kids of their own and moved to Australia. More kids were born once those kids were old enough to have children, but the Colts didn't stray much farther than their own home, if you get what we mean. The children were born through incest. A lot of the kids had defects, and some seemed a little mentally deranged and did things like hurt animals. Many were very sickly and prone to disease. Incest wasn't working out so well for the family. When an investigator found them, he said it was like nothing I'd ever seen. The story sent shivers down Aiden and Ellie's spines, with both of them just sitting for a while in the library, thinking about a team of kids running around with fungal feet trying to set cows on fire. But did it have to be that way? That's the big question today. Some, not many, of King Chulalongkorn's children that he had with sisters went on to have fairly normal lives, though admittedly it's hard to find kids who lived past the age of 40. Aiden and Ellie were now certain that a small gene pool was going to lead to a future offspring of physically and mentally ill kids once their own children started procreating. But what choice did they have? They had one kid, a boy, and named him Carl. Then they had another kid and they named him Asher. Damn, they thought, 2 boys. Then Carl accidentally killed Asher when they were fighting over toys, after which Ellie and Aiden had a 3rd child and named him Sebastian, another boy. With not much to do, these last 2 adult humans just kept pumping out kid after kid, as many in fact as was possible given Ellie's natural aging process. The kids for the most part grew up fine, but the kids' were a different matter altogether. Let us explain something now before we get to the strange case of the extended family. You heard of that thing called DNA. Well, it has packaged into its 23 pairs of chromosomes. Within every chromosome, there are hundreds of thousands of genes. It's these things that will determine human characteristics, such as hair color, but some of them are also bad to the bone, sometimes literally. Every gene has a couple of copies, and they are called alleles. When 2 people have a child, they pass on one pair to the child. There are dominant and recessive genes too. If one pair of genes is dominant, you will have a trait of that gene when it's passed to you. With recessive genes, it's different because you need both pairs of the genes to gain the trait. For example, the gene for brown eyes is dominant. So if you get that, you will have brown eyes. But for blue eyes, it's different because that gene is recessive. You need both recessive genes to get blue eyes. In this case, both your parents passed on blue-eyed pairs of genes. But if one of your parents had the brown-eyed gene, you'd get brown eyes. Importantly though, as you know, not all children get the same DNA from their parents unless they are twins. You get 50% of your DNA from both parents, making 100%. Now imagine that DNA, say from your mom, was half a pack of cards. When the next child is born, that pack is shuffled, so the next child doesn't get the same DNA with all the same genes. But if there were lots of children and you kept shuffling the pack, at some point, some sets of genes will look similar to another child's. This is important to know as we go along with the Aiden and Ellie story. The good news is that many defective traits are carried in recessive genes. This is great because they aren't very common, and to get a harmful trait, you have to get a pair of them. This is exactly why it's good to play the field with strangers. Okay, that's a joke, but if your parents are related, there's more of a chance that they carry some defective gene, and in that case, the child might get a pair, and one thing leads to another, a child is born with a chin that looks like an old boot. If there are generations all from the same gene pool, at some point, even with all the shuffling, some bad genes might match up. The Habsburg Charles II of Spain was the man famous for his chin. It took generations of inbreeding to make him like that. In fact, he was born with scores of defects and disabilities which made his life hell. After many years of suffering, he died at age 38. Just to give you an idea of what can go wrong, here's his autopsy report. Heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs corroded. His intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. When Ellie read that, she fainted on the spot just thinking about future generations of her family. The first thing that came to mind was a grandkid of hers looking like a character from a movie she'd watched as a kid called The Toxic Avenger. But then one day she was reading from another book and something improved her grim mood. She read the lines, "The evidence for the short-term effects of low genetic diversity is very strong, but all these things are probabilistic. There are stories of incredible journeys back from the brink. Anything is possible. You can get very lucky playing cards." Ellie tried to translate that in layman's terms and came to the conclusion that if she and Aiden knocked out enough kids, and those kids knocked out enough kids, then despite the fact that there will be lots of challenges, cow burning even, some of those kids could possibly flourish and the future of mankind could be in the bag. Ellie's hair eventually turned a shade of gray, and at that time her beloved husband was a formidable farmer. Things didn't seem too bad. But some of her grandkids had lives that were, as one of her favorite writers would have put it, nasty and short. She and Aiden had 10 sons, 18 daughters in total. They in turn had kids with each other because that's just how things had to be. Evolution actually wants us to be attracted to people who are genetically different from us, but the future of mankind demanded they make do with each other. Ellie was still worried, having read that there's more of a chance of defects the more inbreeding takes place, such as what happened to the Habsburgs. If only Ellie knew what genes all of her grandkids had, she could safely match them so children weren't born unhealthy, but that wasn't possible. She had a reason for some optimism though, when she read about the people of the small island called Pingalap, who lived far from the busy world in the Western Pacific. These people were almost wiped out in the 18th century when a typhoon struck the island, but 20 of them survived. They flourished after, even though a recessive gene ensured that many years later a tenth of the island was afflicted with color blindness. The thing was, this disorder, called complete achromatopsia, was thought to have come from one man, but it didn't show up in the population until the 4th generation. But still, not everyone got it. This made Ellie happy. She sat there with the book in her hand, and with one of her granddaughters crying from a crib nearby, she repeated those words in her mind. Anything is possible, anything is possible. We are going to bounce back, she said under her breath in a determined voice, even though out of the corner of her eye she glimpsed one of her less successful byproducts giggling while throwing an aerosol can into a small fire. There was a long way to go yet, and what's called the founder effect was still in full swing, meaning a profound lack of genetic diversity as generations interbreed. Still, while Ellie's family admittedly all looked very similar, she held out hope that in generations to come, there would be natural mutations and some diversity would occur. Since Aiden in those days seemed only interested in tending to his vegetables and cattle, he'd become so distant. Ellie read more and more. In some ways, they were a perfect couple, with she being the academic one and he being so good with his hands. One day, Ellie told Aiden that there were instances in history in which animals likely created entire populations after starting as pairs. They were eating when she looked at him and shouted, "Rats!" "What?" replied Aiden, feeling confused. She told him a single pair of rats started a population on some island and the rats thrived. He then gave her a familiar look and said, "Don't tell me you read that in one of those printouts from that old website Quora." Ellie went quiet and returned to her room, where she read the printout again. It said, starlings in North America originated from just 60 individuals. There are a couple 100 million of them now, most of which are nearly genetically identical. That seemed like good news, but she understood that a small population was different from the last two. She couldn't find any examples in her books when an animal species had gone down to the last pair and then started up again. Ellie died first. She was 93. Aiden, 92, held her hand as she drifted into the great unknown. At her side were all her kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. One of them, known as Chinny to the rest, made her moan in distress just before passing away. That poor kid had just put some broken glass in his mouth. But she remembered some words written by a scientist back in 2015. If the whole world were founded by two people, you would have to get lucky in the genetic lottery many times. Ellie and Aiden might have been lucky, but as Ellie took her dying breath, she just couldn't know. Surrounded by all those faces, things didn't look too bad. Nonetheless, she knew things could take a turn for the worst. She also knew that a long time ago some researchers said you'd probably need 98 unrelated humans to repopulate a planet. But there she was, looking at people who had come from her and Aiden. So, could it happen, really? The repopulation of the planet from these two? The answer is yes, it could. Maybe. But as those scientists said, there would have to be a lot of luck. Perhaps if it did happen, thousands of years later, no one would believe the story of Ellie and Aiden, the avid researcher and the Cabbage Patch Kid. The reality is scientists aren't sure how we evolved at the beginning, but they certainly don't think it all kicked off with two randy people in the Garden of Eden. They know there were a couple of types of humans, the Homo genus hanging out in Africa around a couple million years ago, such as Homo habilis, handyman, Homo erectus, upright man, and then it took quite a while for the presence of Homo sapiens, uptight man. Just kidding, it can be translated as wise man. Before Homo sapiens, the oldest form of humans mated with the newer kinds of humans, such as Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthals. Neanderthals and modern humans also mated. So in short, it wasn't as if there was only a very small gene pool when things started. With that in mind, we can't look at the case of Ellie and Aiden and compare it with something from the past. We can only hypothesize that if two people were left alone on the planet, they might be able to fill it up again. It's a long shot, but Ellie and Aiden at least tried. No one could have anticipated the shocking discovery in an old, closed-down, no-frills supermarket in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Contractors went to work on the vacant building thinking they were just going in for the daily grind on an ordinary cold day in January of 2019. They probably started their day like anyone else, drinking a hot cup of coffee before venturing into hard manual labor. But this would be no run-of-the-mill type of workday for them. As they started removing the store's empty shelving units and coolers, they found something deeply disturbing. A human body. It's a sight that most people would rather not have to face or come across, especially not when they least expect it. Authorities could not immediately identify the body or even determine the person's sex or age. It had to be sent to the Iowa State Medical Examiner's office for a thorough autopsy. Only then could the individual be identified as Larry Eli Mario Moncada, a man who had been reported missing 10 years ago back in 2009. Mario Moncada was only 25 years old when he disappeared. He worked as an employee of the no-frills supermarket while it was still operational. The mystery over his initial disappearance turned into a new mystery as the recovery of his remains sparked more questions than answers. People were baffled, wondering how a young guy could just die at work one day and go unnoticed for years on end, almost an entire decade undetected. The man was reported missing on November 28, 2009, during the midst of a heavy snowstorm. His parents last saw him leaving with no shoes, no socks, no keys, and no car. Before his disappearance, he was reportedly experiencing some severe mental health issues. His mother explained that he arrived home from work that Thanksgiving seeming very disoriented. He began hearing voices telling him to eat sugar. He complained that his heart was beating too hard and that he needed sugar to calm it. He also felt that he was being followed and he was very scared. It was possible that he was experiencing some form of psychosis provoked by intense anxiety, causing schizophrenia-like symptoms of paranoia, hallucinations, and delusions. He'd just been prescribed antidepressants by a doctor upon his disappearance. He ran off and was never heard from again. There was no activity on his debit or credit card, and the no-frills supermarket reported that he stopped showing up for work. For a long time, his whereabouts remained unknown. His poor mother must have been frantic. Here's what is believed to have happened. Former employees at the no-frills supermarket explained that they would sometimes climb into the space above the coolers, which was used for storage. Mario Moncada went into work on that fateful day and probably tried to climb into the storage space. Perhaps he was still feeling distressed and needed some time alone to gather himself. Maybe he viewed the storage space as a good place to do this, or perhaps he just needed to grab something. Whatever the case may be, we can speculate that when he pulled himself on top of the coolers, he must have fallen behind them. He then became trapped in the 12-foot, 18-inch wide space between the coolers and the wall. Now, here's the disturbing part of the story. Because the noise being generated by the coolers was so loud, there was probably no way that anyone could have heard him if he screamed for help. That means that if he did not die instantly from the fall, he could have met a very lonely, slow, and terrifying demise, almost like one would feel being buried alive. Only in this case, there were people around who could have helped him, but sadly he was powerless to get their attention. To make matters worse, he wasn't scheduled to work that day, so no one even knew he was there or thought to look for him. By the time he was found, Mario Moncada's body was completely unrecognizable. He was only able to be identified by using the DNA from his parents. This probably provided them with the worst kind of closure, as they probably hoped their son was still alive somewhere. Investigators examined the results of the autopsy and determined his death to be accidental. Still, one can't help but wonder how the no-frills supermarket managed to go so long without discovering the body. It's creepy to think that the employees probably continued to utilize the storage space while not realizing that there was a dead coworker lying beneath them. How, throughout the span of many years, did they never once think to check or clean the space back there? How could a body just remain unfound in a public space for so long? The eerie component to this story may be the thought that this can indeed happen, and if it occurred for Mario Moncada, it can happen to you too. So then you might wonder if this has happened anywhere else. People are reported missing all the time, so how many bodies remain unfound in the most obvious of places? At your local grocery store, your favorite novelty shop, a restaurant you frequently visit. For the Iowa no-frills supermarket, this was certainly the case. Shoppers innocently frequented the store for years, blissfully unaware that death hid behind the coolers in the back room. You see this type of story on crime shows and mystery thrillers, but you never anticipate that something like this could be brought so close to home. For this reason, Mario Moncada's father, Victor Murillo, demanded answers. It's understandable that he would be just as baffled over the situation as anyone else, and even more so since he was directly related to the victim. The grieving father, suffering tremendous pain over the loss, asked the question, how can a body just be there undetected? Investigators described the situation as being very unique, to say the least. The store continued to run for 7 long years after Mario Moncada's fatal disappearance. It only just closed its doors in 2016, 3 years before his body was uncovered. Perhaps after hearing this story, you may never walk into a supermarket the same way again. It's hard to think about and spooky enough to make your skin crawl, yet it teaches a ghastly lesson that tragedy can lurk in the shadows of everyday mundane life. And there is another lesson to be learned from the events that led to Moncada's disappearance and death. That is, the problems associated with his mental health that pushed him to run away from home in the first place and act in irrational ways. heading out amid a snowstorm without being properly equipped with shoes or socks. We here at the Infographic Show believe in the vitality of mental health, and if you or someone you know struggles from anxiety or cognitive disturbance, you should seek help right away. Your mental health is as important as your physical health and should be taken just as seriously. There's nothing shameful about receiving help, and we strongly encourage it. The circumstances surrounding the death of Mario Moncada are unfortunate and mysterious. One can't help but wonder what he must have experienced or felt during his final hours. Though grim, one can only hope that when he fell he landed on his head and died instantaneously, because at least that would have been a far better fate than what could have transpired against him. Namely, being consumed by the fear and awareness of being trapped. Since the autopsy of his body could not find an exact cause of death, there is no way to know for certain what went on behind those coolers during the time. All we know for sure is that it went on under the noses of those working and shopping at that no-frills supermarket, and this is a grisly reality that won't soon be forgotten. A sweet 6-year-old girl looks up at her mom and in a very serious voice tells her, "I wouldn't sleep in your bedroom if I were you." The mom has kinda grown used to her daughter saying freaky stuff to her, but still it comes as a shock. What is the girl seeing? What's behind her dark thoughts? To better understand this girl, you have to know that she doesn't even think her parents are her real parents. She once announced to her alleged imposter parents that her real mom and pop were dead. She said to them, "No big deal, you're just my second set, I'm okay with that." If that isn't disturbing enough, the girl sees what she calls skeleton men running around the house. They run through the walls, they inhabit the room where her parents sleep. Sometimes dressed as soldiers, they walk through the living room while everyone's watching TV. This is a true story. Well, allegedly. And the girl is now grown up and remembers nothing about accusing her parents of being fake. She can't even recall seeing the skeleton men. She's forgotten all about a friend she used to have who lived in the spooky attic. That friend, Felicia, was of course a figment of the girl's imagination. But the question is, what was going on in that girl's head? As you'll see today, she's one of the many children who say the creepiest stuff to their parents. In fact, some kids say they've had past lives, and that they make a very, very strong case for that being true. They remember entire villages where they've never been. They know their old houses, their old lovers, the clothes they used to wear. They know things they just shouldn't know. It's frankly unbelievable. But sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Other times, well, it's just fiction. Let's now have a look at some amazing cases of reincarnated kids. A child was born on April 10, 1998 in the state of Louisiana. He was named James Leininger, the son of Bruce and Andrea. He was a healthy baby and a joy to his doting parents, but not so long after he learned how to talk, he announced something incredibly strange to his mom and pop. He told them that they were in fact not his parents. In the year 2000, the 2-year-old told his parents that he remembered being an Air Force pilot during the Second World War. Don't turn off yet, dear viewers, because you're about to hear that young James had a very convincing story. It's not the most convincing past life story you'll hear today, but it's up there with the best. Okay, so James might not have had those memories had his parents not taken him to a World War II exhibit. No sooner than he got there was he absolutely fascinated by the planes he saw. He was so fascinated with planes that his parents took him to the exhibit a second time. But on seeing one plane in a hangar, James suddenly became quiet and looked quite sad. After that trip, he developed a habit of just repeating the words, "airplane crash on fire." He would then take his toy planes and smash them down on the kitchen table, so hard that he destroyed the planes and made dents in the wood. Okay, thought his parents, our kid seems a bit traumatized by the war exhibit. Maybe we made a mistake taking him in the first place. Things got much worse. James then started waking up in the middle of the night screaming and screaming. Sometimes he'd scream and then shout, "Airplane crash on fire!" One time his mother and he dropped his father off at the airport, and James' reassuring words to his pop were, "Daddy, airplane crash on fire." James was starting to become a bit of a downer. But he had many more surprises in store. He started having hissy fits. He'd just writhe around screaming, kicking, punching, shouting, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." After a few weeks of this, he started telling his parents that during the war he'd flown a fighter plane called a Corsair. 6 months short of his 3rd birthday, he told them he'd flown his plane off a boat called the Natoma. Unless he was secretly using Google, he just couldn't have known that such a boat existed. His father went online and discovered that during the war, there was such a boat. It was the USS Natoma Bay, an escort carrier that sailed in the Pacific Ocean. His parents, now truly spooked, asked James a number of times the name of the little man in the plane. For a while, James kept telling him that he was the little man, but after a while he said the words Jack Larson. He told his parents that Jack Larson was in the plane with him when it was shot down. His father gave him a book called The Battle for Iwo Jima 1945, and James looked at all the pictures. When he saw a picture of the Mount Suribachi dormant volcano, James told his pop, "That's it, that's where my plane was shot down." The father turned to his son with an incredulous look on his face, and James reiterated, "My airplane got shot down there, Daddy." James's father didn't give his son up to the local mental health facility and instead looked for veterans of the war that had been on the USS Natoma. He found one. And guess what? He served with a guy named Jack Larson. This was all getting to be a bit too much now for James's parents, so they started researching children who claimed they'd had past lives. They found a woman named Carol Bowman who'd written a book on the topic, and following her advice, they assured James that the past was the past and he didn't have to worry about it. The war was over, he was now safe. James's nightmares stopped after that. James's third birthday passed and he had taken up a new hobby, drawing battle scenes. He signed all his sketches James 3. And when asked why, he told his parents it was because he was living his third life. This doesn't make sense until you know that James's father found something out when he attended a Natoma Bay reunion. He discovered that a John M. Larson had served on that ship, and if you don't know, Johns are sometimes given the nickname Jack. The father had found out that Jack actually had survived the war, although he wasn't at the reunion. Not one to give up, the father went looking for Jack and he found him. Jack told him that only one pilot had crashed after taking off from that ship. His name was James M. Houston Jr. The 21-year-old from Pennsylvania had been shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Now we have James Sr., James Jr., and James the Freaky Kid. Houston was shot down during an 8-plane assault. Through research, James's father had discovered the plane next to Houston's was flown by none other than Jack Larson. His father was now convinced that his son had once lived the life of James Houston Jr. James's parents claimed that their son gave them many details about the war, and the stuff he told them about his other family's life was confirmed by the real James Houston's sister. Okay, so now you might be thinking, fraud, especially when you hear that his parents made money from a book they wrote about the case of their strange son. But you should know that this case has been investigated thoroughly, and it seems that no one thinks the whole thing is a hoax. Investigators think it was more likely that James lived in some kind of fantasy world that was triggered by that first visit to the war exhibit. That might explain the nightmares, but it doesn't explain Jack Larson and James Houston. James could not have read about those names, and there are no known TV shows that have featured them or the Natoma. This is what one investigator concluded after very lengthy research, including talking many times to all the people involved. The documentation in James's case provides evidence that he had a connection with the life from the past. On the face of it, the most obvious explanation for this connection is that he experienced a life as James Houston Jr. before having his current one. Are you convinced? You know that children have vivid imaginations, and you know that any child psychiatrist will tell you that it's not out of the ordinary for young children to be rather obsessed by death, dead people, and ghosts. Still, reincarnated kids? That's not easy to believe. Now you need to hear this. In the 1950s, a British couple named Florence and John Pollock had 2 kids, Joanna and Jacqueline. The kids had a happy childhood and were inseparable. One thing you need to know is that Jacqueline had a big scar on her forehead from an accident, and Joanna had a birthmark on the left side of her stomach. To cut a long story short, they were both killed when a car struck them on a country road. Joanna was 11 and her sister was 6. It was a big case at the time because it seemed that the female driver had driven right into them after swerving around on the road. That driver took her life shortly after the accident. Some years later, the couple had more children, twins they named Jillian and Jennifer. The father was convinced that these 2 new girls were Jacqueline and Joanna reincarnated, and he was more convinced when he saw that Jennifer seemed to have a funny mark on her forehead that looked like Jacqueline's scar. Her sister also had a birthmark where Joanna had one. These 2 twins suddenly started to call their toys the same names that the deceased kids called them. They knew of landmarks and places they'd never been to. They knew what school the dead girls had attended. Then things got dark. The young twins started playing a game that involved one girl lying on the floor and the other girl pretending to attend to her bloodied head. Not long after that, whenever the pair walked near a car, they'd start screaming. The strange case came to the attention of a paranormal psychologist named Dr. Ian Stevenson. He studied the girls for many years, often following them around while they were growing up. His conclusion was they were reincarnations of their deceased sisters. He was very aware that the sisters' behaviors could have been the result of the father thinking they were reincarnations, but after spending so much time with them, he concluded that this just wasn't possible. He believed the girls were so young they couldn't have possibly learned their crazy behavior. Something strange was afoot, said the doctor. Still not convinced? You will be by the time the show is over. Can you imagine if your 3-year-old son suddenly started saying that he'd been shot to death? That's what Kakshapa Ishwara told his parents in 1975. His parents didn't believe a word of it, but then his twin brother Indika started to remember a past life of his own. In fact, Indika remembered so much that his parents were able to find out who he was speaking of. They actually went to visit the dead kid's parents, and immediately Indika fell in love with them. Then there was the case of reincarnated Burmese twins. They said they'd been Japanese soldiers during the war. They spoke a language no one could understand, and they demanded to be taken back to Japan. They were girls, but they acted like boys while growing up. Balderdash, you're thinking, because you don't believe a word of this, and you like to say balderdash a lot in a manner that suggests you're an authority on matters. We don't blame you for either of those things, but you need to hear more before you make up your mind. Now we'll introduce Ryan. When Ryan was 4, he had a very vivid imagination, so much so his parents would often hear him shout "action" from his bedroom. The kid used to think he was directing his very own movies. There was a problem with his colorful imagination though, and that was the fact that he had terrible nightmares. He'd scream and scream in his sleep, and then when his parents woke him up, he'd tell them, "Mom, my heart exploded in Hollywood." They took him to a doctor, and the doctor said he'll grow out of it. He kept on having those nightmares, and then one time after he was awoken, he told his mom that he thought he had lived a life of someone else. He said he lived in a big white house with a large swimming pool. The place was in Hollywood, a very different place to the Oklahoma where he lived. His mother didn't really believe her son had lived in Hollywood, but the now 5-year-old Ryan went on about it every day of the week. He was totally convinced of his other life. The mom reluctantly brought books home from the library that contained photos of Hollywood in the past. On one occasion, they were looking through one of the books, and Ryan stopped at a particular photo. He said, "Hey mom, that's George. We did a picture together." He then looked at another photo and said, "That's me, I found me." The movie was a 1930s hit called Night After Night. The strange thing is, the book didn't provide any names of the men in the photo, so Ryan's mom did a bit of investigating. She found out that the guy her son had said was named George was in fact named George. He was George Raft, a movie star. The problem was that she wasn't able to find out who the other guy was. Then she went online and found Jim B. Tucker, a psychiatry professor who'd spent years investigating the claims of people who said they'd had past lives. It should be said that Tucker is a serious scientist, and he looks at every angle when investigating these claims. Tucker turned up at Ryan's home with 4 black and white photos. 3 of them were random people. When Tucker asked Ryan if any of the women were familiar to him, he pointed to one. She was the wife of a guy named Martin Martin. This guy was the man in the photo who Ryan claimed to have been. The reason he was so hard to track down is that he only had been in movies as an uncredited extra. Tucker didn't stop there. He went in search of Martin's living family, and he found his daughter. At first, she wanted nothing to do with Tucker or some crazy kid, but when Tucker told her lots of intimate details about her father that Ryan had told him, she was flabbergasted. There was no way this kid could have known these things. There were dozens of facts, and here are some of them. Ryan said he'd been a dancer on Broadway. True. He said he'd been a talent agent and worked with people who changed their names. True. He said he got sunburned a lot. True. He had 2 sisters. True. His mom had curly brown hair. True. He had 4 wives. True. He had a green car and his wife had a black car. True. He had an African maid. True. He owned a piano. True. He said his home, where he lived as Martin, had the word rock on it. True. He said he lived at 825 North Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. True. He said he'd been friends with a man named Senator Five. Not true. Her father had been friends with a man named Senator Ives. All in all, Ryan knew over 50 facts about Martin's life, and most of these facts were impossible to find online. When Ryan was introduced to the person who was his daughter from a past life, he was scared. Remember, Ryan was just a young kid then. He hid behind his mom and said something had changed. His mother told him that people had to grow up. Ryan told her that he never ever wanted to go back to Hollywood. He didn't much like his daughter as an old woman. Tucker had investigated over 2,500 cases, and to this day, scientific research can't really explain what's going on. It doesn't get any easier attending the funeral of someone you love. This was the funeral of my wife, one of many wives. I'm telling you this because she is one of my fondest memories. Where humans are concerned, love is the only law, and that's coming from a man who has literally seen everything. She was a healthy 146 when she died. Yeah, science never came up with a solution for falling off a cliff. A man next to me utters the usual refrain. She was a fine woman. My thoughts and prayers are with you. Humanity went through many changes, but in terms of death speech, we were always predictable, right up until the last human took his final breath. The year of my wife's funeral, I was technically 387 years old, which made me a baby in relative terms. Those days, they only used aquamation, dissolving bodies in water. Basic stuff, it would turn out. The universe would disappear one day, and I'll be there. But I guess you want to know how it got to that point. I was born on January 1st, 2000. I have no idea who my parents were, since the story I've been told is that I was found by 3 hikers on a hilltop wrapped in a blanket of fur that was slightly lit by the North Star. I went into foster care, but around the age of 18, I told my foster parents I wanted to travel the world. I got to the age of around 35, and I think that's about the time I stopped aging. When I hit 45, people would say to me, "Ooh, you look so good for your age." When I hit 55, things got really weird. I had to start telling everyone I was taking supplements, and in the end, I just left the country, not wanting to become a scientific research project. The good thing was that I was almost constantly on the move and seemed to be good at everything I did. My first life was easy. I had a natural aptitude for everything. And when I say natural, I mean I could do anything I wanted. Back when humanity was still here and in its early stages, I was a doctor, a professional rugby player in New Zealand, a Martian virologist, a British biologist who spent most of his time studying fleas, a very successful autonomous flying vehicle salesman, and a fairground puppeteer in New Hampshire. Oh, and I can't mention all the jobs. There were lots of them before work became almost obsolete. I had as much money as I needed, when we still used money, of course, although it was sometimes difficult keeping my identity hidden when banking the stuff, when we still had banks. Banks we would later say were from the second dark age. You're probably wondering how I managed to not have an accident and maybe get all chewed up. Well, back before we started eating only lab-made artificial meat, I fell into an industrial meat grinder. I'll take that as my best death ever. I loved that job too. Being an expert in every lifetime gets boring after a while, so I was sausage meat. Don't ask me how it happens, but after every death I would just wake up in some place in this same body. One body could die, but another would appear. I'd look in the mirror and I was the same man. I had a soul, and it seemed I was immortal. I kind of liked the days when accidents were common. It made life more fun. But once humans stopped working and using machines to do all the work, people didn't have many accidents. But like I said, one of my wives fell off a cliff. May she rest in peace. She was the only one I stayed with until the end, because I told her my secret. The rest I left after a few years. That wasn't always easy, I can tell you. Okay, so let me take you through the first chapter of my life, the short period of about 500 years. It'll have to be an abridged version, because I'm pretty sure you don't need to know about all my personal romances, achievements, and so on. This story is about you guys, not about me. And all I'll say is after 100 or so funerals, it doesn't get any easier. Love is infinite, and listen to me when I tell you, it is the greatest thing in the universe. You guys actually figured that out for a while after the Great Machine Occupation and ensuing war, when you finally did away with class oppression. Hundreds of years before the war, you guys got pretty good at creating artificial intelligence, and this meant a lot of you had no jobs to do. But the problem was, this created inequality like the world had never seen. And this started around the 2050s. Before you start thinking that we could replicate human brains and robots that were just like us, stop, because we never could. There is something in all of you that cannot be replicated. It was the great mystery for science of all ilk, and that was what is consciousness. What makes you you? It's your soul, and when you die, it doesn't mean that you get to become a ghost and start moving around household objects just to scare American families to death. It just means you're a presence. You've been left behind. Kind of an after effect, but something that now has no thoughts of its own. You become part of everything. Just as that Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza said when he wasn't grinding those lenses of his, you have a soul and we are all connected. That's why, my friends, that love is the law. Don't you ever forget it. Anyway, enough with the lecturing. So in the early 3rd millennium, we started using some world-changing technologies. We used these to create robots that did most of the work for us. They were not at first that intelligent, so no, they did not sit down with you and chat about your ongoing agony regarding your sense of futility. They were like Alexa, but with better answers. They did all the hard work, and partly because of this, we had less to do. At first, there was this great divide, when anyone who owned these technologies grew incredibly rich. But then there was the Great Revolt, and incredibly rich people soon understood that it was no good being rich when you were dead. We soon genetically engineered most of our food, and we put an end to environmental degradation. The world flourished for a while, and we called this the Second Renaissance. We still had cattle, but things like cows became almost ornamental. We actually had a pet cow, and she was lovely. My girlfriend wanted to call her Daisy, but we decided on Ermintrude. We could even make genetically engineered milk. Humans from 2250 looked back at humans in 2020 as total savages. Those barbarians, they said, were cruel, nasty, they were imbeciles. We had colonized Mars by this time, but as exciting as that might sound to you, people didn't much like living in spaces from which they could not move out of unless they wore a pressurized spacesuit. Life on Mars was a bit of a chore. Even Elon Musk would have admitted it was a bit dull up there if he'd lived to see it. At first, Mars was more like a gimmicky thing. I think it was about in 2880 or something that we finally terraformed the planet. That means creating an inhabitable atmosphere there. Still, I always preferred Earth. I remember a guy once joking with me when we were on Mars. This was after we'd terraformed the place, and I said to him, "It's a bit of an anticlimax," and he laughed and replied, "Yeah, the grass is always greener." You'd only get that if you'd been on Mars, because while we did learn how to grow grass on the red planet, it was never like the luscious green grass of Earth. His joke was what you'd call a double entendre. Okay, so after the Great Divide came the Great Awakening, and that's when humans started sharing everything. We had no need to work, really, and the work we did was more in line with helping people and creating things. There was hardly any crime, and we viewed the justice system of your time like you now view medieval torture. The problem was those machines we'd created had become super intelligent, and that didn't mean that they could fall in love and tell us how great they thought the movie Blade Runner was, but it meant that they could solve problems that we couldn't. And by the way, we didn't actually watch movies in those days. We were movies. Virtual reality was as real as life, and you could choose your story. Anyway, as I said, this was great at the start. Machines didn't just do all the heavy lifting, but they devised ways to make everything sustainable. The thing was, some idiot asked a machine how to end depression, loneliness, anxiety, sorrow, and all the human emotions we didn't much like. The emotions that made us, us. The machine's answer to that was a contradiction because for those emotions not to exist, we couldn't exist. The simple solution to the problem was to terminate us. This wasn't out of animosity. Like I said, robots didn't have feelings. Our brains are way too complex. They wanted to terminate us because we had asked the machines to solve a problem. It wasn't personal. Some of those machines were weapons. While wars were a thing of the past, we used powerful destructive devices for things like drilling and creating cities in places that were once uninhabited. And we also stockpiled weapons in case of an extraterrestrial invasion. You've also got to understand that simple robots were household appliances. I had a robot dog that doubled as a lawnmower and a leaf blower. It's a long story, and I have a long way to go, but I'll tell you that before we won the war, lots of human lives were lost. The superintelligence was interconnected, so before you could say, oops, the machines turned on us. A friend of mine was killed by his own fridge. In the end, we created another superintelligence whose sole purpose was to defend humanity. Then we had something called the Machine Wars, while we hid out in the underworld, something that we'd created about a century earlier. The underworld was devised in case of natural catastrophes, such as asteroid hits or supervolcanoes going off. As you'll find out, we didn't do a very good job. So the good machines won, and we never made the mistake again of asking silly questions. Human emotions weren't something you can fix. We are what we are, even though a few wacky transhumanist neuroscientists did try playing around with our brains a bit. All machines were made from then on with a default mode that insisted that they must self-destruct if they asked to answer any question that could endanger a human life. And let me tell you, it took about another 100 years to get that right. As an example, a guy I knew asked his robot if getting married was a good idea, and the robot just blew up right in front of him. After analyzing the guy's and his girlfriend's trove of personal data and taking into the possibility of divorce, this was a dangerous question. I should have told you that sometime in the 4th century of the 3rd millennia, we had started living a lot longer and living healthier lives. This was mostly down to nanotechnology called cell manipulation. The thing was, we never got past around the age of 160. We just couldn't figure that out. But after time, we realized it was the mind-soul thing again. The mind can have enough. It turned out that around the age of 160, we just gave up. And maybe that's the way it was meant to be. And yes, there is a mind-soul duality, a spirit if you like. I'm living proof. To be honest with you, living forever isn't all it's cracked up to be. There's a beauty in death because it makes you appreciate life. I had a bout of chronic depression that lasted around 300 years because of that. I lost all purpose for a while. I begged for death. I prayed for death. Death was love to me. Without death, I lost the will to live. Anyway, I won't bore you with my psychological problems. We're gonna move on now to something big. Around 3500, the Earth's magnetic poles reversed, or should I say they'd been reversing, but something just happened fast. The fallout from that was more cosmic rays hitting us, and that meant more radiation. We had to hide underground for a while, and some people took off to Mars. Eventually, we developed a way to deflect the cosmic rays, but we lost a lot of humans to radiation-related sickness. The underground couldn't sustain us for long. A catastrophic event for you guys happened around 5,000 years later, and that was a supervolcanic eruption. This was so huge that the volcanic ash blocked out the sun and covered a large part of the planet. This killed many people and animals and destroyed much of what we'd built. Water supplies were contaminated and much of our electronic infrastructure that we relied on was destroyed. It made a huge mess of the natural environment too. This event cooled the planet and the atmosphere was filled with toxic gases. Suffice to say, it was a bit of a torrid time for you guys, but much worse was to come. It was called the greatest catastrophe since the dawn of civilization. But of course you didn't say it like that because the language you spoke didn't sound much like the one I'm talking to you in. Language evolved. Do you understand this? Ik bidde themale salis te sprekene? I'm guessing you don't because it's Old English. It meant please speak more slowly. Anyway, after the eruption, the population almost halved. Since many people grew sick or died from lack of food and water, or couldn't live in colder climates, this created a mass migration. With so much infrastructure down and so much panic, the era of the Great Peace was over. Many of you got all savagey again. Population decline made sure that getting started again wasn't easy, but I won't bore you with the building details because soon you're about to all become extinct. You'd survived world wars, you'd survived machine wars, you just about got over a supervolcanic eruption, but in the year 13,462 you had a period of global warming. The Wilkes Basin ice melted and the consequence of that was that sea levels rose 3 or 4 meters. The sun getting hotter was no fault of yours. The fiery thing just turned up the heat. Cities near the coastline disappeared and there was more migration. The eruption took much of the human population with it, and the floods took a lot of what was left. The population was reduced again, and instead of living in large communities connected globally, you started separating yourself from others and surviving in small communities. It was a bit like the old hunter-gatherer days, although strands of civilization existed. The Earth had taken such a beating over these years that the magnificent technological infrastructure that you had built almost completely disappeared. Your peaceful ways were abandoned, and like brutes from the past, gangs of men would raid communities. The population problem was real, and even women were stolen so they could procreate for various communities. You lived like this for thousands of years, slowly rebuilding what you had built before. Communities again collaborated, but much of what had been destroyed was not salvageable. You simply could not emerge as a technological species because the Earth's population had been reduced so much, and you lost so much infrastructure. You did at least have books and artifacts from the past, but these were not understandable by the majority of people. Those on Mars fared better at first, but due to the heating up of the sun, that planet became almost uninhabitable. Because the terraformed environment there was so much less diverse, the Martian colony became extinct first. The final blow-up, the coup de grace, came with an impact from a large asteroid in the year 22,569. The impact created giant tsunamis and the Earth burned. It threw so much moisture and dust in the air that the sunlight was blocked. Some of you died quickly and others died slowly. I wept as I saw my 2 friends starve to death, both of them wondering why I wasn't worried at all. I wanted to die, but I had a long, long way to go. I wandered around that barren planet alone for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. You could say this was quite a boring era in my long life. I kept dying and reappearing. I was surely cursed to see this whole thing through to the end. Life forms still existed, but most were small animals. Snails became my best friends. I would hold them in my hand and talk to them. The first was named Brian, then came Brian 2, and so on. I married Brian 3 out of sheer boredom. I must move on because you need to know how it all ends. Hundreds of thousands of years was nothing in the great scheme of things. For millions of years, I waited for something to happen, for evolution to kickstart and you guys to slowly come back, for something to crawl out of the swamp, for anything to happen. After a billion years, things got so hot that the ocean started to evaporate. After almost 3 billion years, all life forms were extinct except for me. My body no longer existed in its physical form because of the severe heat, but my mind carried on. I really was a ghost. Billions more years passed and the sun started burning hydrogen in a shell around its core, becoming a big red giant. Oceans of lava floated on the surface before the Earth itself was engulfed by the sun. I became mere consciousness in the universe, like a god able to witness the unraveling of the enterprise that started with a big bang. After 120 trillion years, and man, I was getting bored by then, there were only about 100 stars left in the Milky Way. The missing ones had literally run out of energy. I was still there, in space, just thinking, come on, just let this damn place end. I longed for the days I could fall into a meat grinder or tell jokes on Mars. Life was beautiful and I missed it dearly. Finally, after hundreds of quadrillions of years, the whole place was empty, like a football stadium during one of your many pandemics. The universe was a vacuum and we had entered a dark era. But what was nothing? What exactly was nothing? Subatomic particles were still there. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I knew that those particles were busy trying to break down a barrier. I just felt it. They joined forces and strained together, propagating. I was witnessing a birth. Uh-oh, I thought, here we go again. And I realized I was observing another Big Bang. The whole thing was starting again. I was seeing the eternal recurrence, a cycle both violent and beautiful. The universe started kicking and screaming like the thousands of newborn babies I'd fathered when humans existed. And that's what I'm watching right now. I've got a long time to wait until I see the next generation of you guys, but I'm at peace. In this cosmic arena, there is more than just matter. There is me, an eternal soul, a timeless monument to the spirit, an enduring love and light that I can't explain and don't want to explain. So I'll see you guys in the next life a few billion years from now. Don't forget to be nice to each other next time. Life is precious. That's what you'll learn when you live forever. There seems to be some disagreement as to who has spent the most time in solitary confinement, but you can find a handful of people that did over 40 years without much contact with other people. The record might well be smashed by the British prisoner called Robert Maudsley, aka the Brain Eater or the real-life Hannibal the Cannibal, who's now done over 40 years in solitary. The man we're going to talk about today might be behind in terms of years spent kept away from the other prison population, but there's another reason he's called the most isolated prisoner in the world. Mr. Silverstein, who was born in 1952, has been in prison since 1977. Back then, he was convicted of armed robbery and sent to the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas to do his time. You might be curious why armed robbery with no deaths would warrant such a long sentence, but it's what Tommy did inside the prison that made the difference. He has been given the epithet America's most dangerous prisoner, and while the media is prone to exaggeration at times, he certainly has been very dangerous within the confines of U.S. prisons. During his time behind bars, he's been convicted of killing 4 people, although one of those convictions was overturned. For that, he was later given a specially designed solitary cell, and one that he would have to spend 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. According to blog posts written not long before we started writing this show, Silverstein had some very serious health complications, but we're told that the Bureau of Prisons will not release any information as to his condition. He was put into intensive care, although we're told not even his family were allowed to visit him. This is how isolated this prisoner is, and we should add that by the time you watch this show, there might not even be a Tommy Silverstein. But now let's look at how he got into this point in his life. We're told that Tommy grew up in Long Beach, California. While pregnant with him, his mother got a divorce, though she then married again. Silverstein claims that the second man is his real father. He wasn't around that long anyway because his mother divorced again and married a Mr. Silverstein, and this man legally adopted the young Tommy. From what we can see, he didn't exactly come from the wrong side of the tracks. It's said he lived a middle-class kind of life, but was very shy and certainly not a tough kid at the start. He was bullied for various reasons, but it's written that because of his name, the other kids used to pick on him for being Jewish in a neighborhood where there weren't many Jewish people. It's said he soon toughened up and fought back, with Silverstein saying his mother didn't suffer fools or bullies gladly. Most bio websites post this comment that Silverstein once made about his childhood. "That's how my mom was. She stood her mud. If someone came at you with a bat, you got your bat and you both went at it." So it seems he was a slightly troubled kid, but he didn't get into serious trouble until he was 19 years old. That's when he was arrested for armed robbery the first time. He was sent to San Quentin and served 4 years. Not long after getting out, he met his father, the real one that he says is his biological father, and also his uncle. The three were eventually arrested for 3 armed robberies. It seemed Silverstein, being so young, garnered some sympathy, with those people saying the young man had been taken in by the older men. The judge wasn't buying any of that lack of parental guidance stuff though, and sentenced Tommy to 15 years. He wouldn't get out of prison again and might never if his present sickness gets the better of him. Even if he survives that, it's very unlikely he'll ever get out of prison again. It's said his release date is officially 2095. So if he makes it to 143, he might feel the wind on his back again. While in prison in Kansas, he developed a friendship with members of the Aryan Brotherhood. In 1980, Tommy, now 28, was convicted of killing a fellow inmate. The story goes that the inmate had turned down an offer he couldn't refuse. That was to be a drug mule for the white gang. This is what the TV show Crime Investigation had to say. As an inductee of the Aryan Brotherhood, Terrible Tom happily committed acts of violence, which soon escalated to murder. He violently killed DC Black's gang member Danny Atwell. We should say though that his conviction was overturned, with some of the witnesses later charged with lying in court. Silverstein was then sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which was said to be a very tough prison. Silverstein had been given a life sentence for that murder, but obviously that had been reversed after the perjury charge. But then he was accused of killing another DC Blacks member, Robert Chappelle. Silverstein always denied this, and then the Bureau of Prisons did something one could call worthy of redress. They moved the nationwide leader of the DC Blacks, Raymond Cadillac Smith, to Marion while Silverstein was on trial for Chappelle's murder. I tried to tell Cadillac that I didn't kill Chappelle, but he didn't believe me and he bragged that he was going to kill me, Silverstein would later say. He added that no one tried to keep the men apart, and it was believed by him and the other prisoners that the guards wanted one of the men to kill the other. A more cynical person would say that the system wanted one less violent inmate. The one less they eventually got was Cadillac, who was stabbed 67 times by Silverstein. He did this with another member of the Aryan Brotherhood called Clayton Fountain. Crime Investigation writes that Silverstein walked up and down the wing with the dead body to show the others what might happen if they decided to try and take him out. We're told after this he became one of the top guys in the Aryan Brotherhood. He was also given another life sentence. So now we bring in an officer called Merle Eugene Klutz. He was supposed to maintain order in the violent wing of the prison, but Silverstein has always maintained that Klutz came in with a very heavy hand. He was there to especially watch Silverstein, and the latter said that he didn't only watch him, but regularly tormented him. That culminated with the death of Klutz. One day in 1983, he and other guards were taking Silverstein to the shower block. On the way, with the help of another prisoner, Silverstein got out of his handcuffs with a homemade key and stabbed the officer with a shank or a homemade weapon that he'd been handed. The autopsy report revealed that Silverstein stabbed Klutz around 40 times. Silverstein has always said he did this because Klutz had treated him particularly badly, even for prison. An investigation revealed that wasn't the case, but Silverstein said the investigation itself was corrupt. He was transferred to a different prison at this time, where he murdered another guard. What followed was a 23-year lockdown at Marion. Some say these two incidents were the reason the first Supermax prison was built in the US. You might guess that this was the beginning of Silverstein's days in solitary. It wasn't normal solitary though. It was what's called total isolation. That means 24 hours a day in the cell and lights are on all the time. His security status was no human contact. Not many prisoners get this, with Silverstein and the British maniac we mentioned at the start of the show being the most notorious. Advocates of human rights have said such isolation is not far from a torture technique used by the military and sometimes extremists called whitewashing. Gradually, the BOP started giving Silverstein books and a TV. But skeptics say this only happened because the Bureau realized that in order to really punish someone in prison, the prisoner can't just have nothing. You need to give him something and then take it away. This is the Torture 101 style we see in the movies, such as Silence of the Lambs when Dr. Lecter has his books taken away. We should add that his self-contained cell is a bit bigger than usual cells. For one thing, it has to have a shower as he can't go to the shower room. We've seen plenty of sketches online that Tommy himself drew of his cell. We might also add that Silverstein didn't hate all guards. In a now famous case, one part of a prison was overtaken by Cuban rioters in 1987. Silverstein was let out of his cell, and he could go anywhere he liked for a short time. The Cubans held guards hostage, and so the authorities were concerned that Silverstein would hurt or even kill them. One of the guards had known Silverstein for a long time, but no bad came to him. It said he had always been kind to the prisoner, asking him on occasions if his handcuffs were too tight. Still, Silverstein said some of the guards would torment him often. In fact, you can read a blog that includes a note written by Silverstein that must have been written just before he fell ill. There he talks about deprivation, saying, "Dear friends and supporters, as I've noted for decades with each new warden administration, that they rotate every 3 years or so, usually takes away from what we've got instead of gives us more." He adds, "They gotta flex their muscles as cowards do with the hopeless and helpless." In the last paragraph, he talks about what his solitary confinement is like, saying, "Like the monotone bars and walls that entomb me, they've stamped out the colors of happiness that I enjoy sharing with the outside world, enforcing a black and white existence in this colorless hole of madness." Other blog posts written by friends of Silverstein tell us that his writing and art have been confiscated at times, and getting anything creative out of prison has been hard. We found a lot more of Tommy's thoughts that have been published on blogs. He writes in other posts that, unlike even the worst case of confinement, he can't even shout across a corridor. His isolation is what you might call extreme solitude. He writes that things have happened to him that have never been reported, and he adds that inside the prison walls things go on that seldom make it onto those prison TV shows. For him, the penal system is unjust. The prison system in general is not about rehabilitation for the most part, he believes. As for solitary, he writes, "History and studies clearly show that solitary confinement does more harm than good, that it reveals the idiocy and sadistic mentality of prison administrators who embrace this barbaric medieval practice, and that it is a crime against humanity." The guards didn't see it that way, with one prison official once telling an author, "We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life a living hell. Otherwise, inmates will kill guards too. There has to be some supreme punishment." We should add that Silverstein does get to visit people now and again, but never in close quarters and always with glass and a telephone. One visitor recently wrote, he was told there were certain things he was not allowed to discuss with me, one being the book he is writing. Tom talked about his desire to further his education. I had no idea there's no longer funding for prisoners to study. The enemy's moving again. It's not difficult to spot them. They plod along in the heavy snow with light brown uniforms, standing out like hay bale practice targets against the pristine white snow. Despite this being the height of winter, nobody bothered to issue the Russian occupiers winter uniforms. Simo Haya isn't one to complain though. If anything, he's grateful. Certainly, it makes his job easier. He doesn't use a modern telescopic sight the way many of his fellow scouts do. Sure, the fancy glass is nice for really long-range shots, but it also glints in the sunlight. He's seen too many of his friends get their heads blown off after a stray glint gave them away. Many of the enemy too. Only this time it was him delivering the death. Besides, using telescopic sights means you have to raise your head just a few extra inches than you do with iron sights, and that's all it takes to get the top of your head blown off. If it wasn't bad enough, the cold weather often fogs up the glass, basically rendering a shooter useless. Instead, he uses good old-fashioned iron sights on his antiquated Seiko M2830. It's been in service since 1891, but most of the troops prefer newer models with fancier sights. For Simo, though, it's all he needs to do his deadly work, and he does it with deadly accuracy. Now he watches the squad of Soviet soldiers trudging through the snow, slowly working their way toward his position. He couldn't ask for better targets. The men stand out like sore thumbs in their brown coats, and their lack of snowshoes slows them down to practically a crawl. They can thank Stalin for that, he thinks, as he scans the small formation and starts mentally assigning an order to each kill. It was Stalin's paranoid purges of the Red Army that saw it left with a bunch of idiots running everything. That's the only way to explain the terrible performance of the Russian military to date, invading a country a fraction of their size and barely able to move more than a few miles in weeks of fighting. The fools even drive tanks over frozen lakes without surveying them first, only to collapse into the ice and drown their crews. Stalin's purge of any Soviet leadership he thought presented a threat to his rule has not just cost the Red Army its best generals and tacticians, but its mostly capable logistics personnel too. What kind of an idiot would send an entire army to fight in Finland in the middle of winter without snowshoes or white coats to help camouflage the soldiers? Simo clears his head. He's done assigning his kill order. Whoever that idiot is, he's grateful. Slow, steady pressure on the trigger and the old rifle barks out a sharp retort. Less than half a second later, a Russian soldier falls backward into the snow. Perfect shot. Right below the throat. The Russians panic and begin to scatter. Some begin to return fire, shooting blindly into the snow-covered landscape in front of them. Simo curses under his breath as he moves his sights to his next target. He'd miscalculated the soldier's movement. He meant to fire once the man had firm footing on his next step. That would have prevented him from flying straight backwards and thus giving away the direction of the fire. Instead, he caught him just a breath too late, with the rear foot already in motion and the soldier off balance when the bullet struck, leaving him with only one way for the massive kinetic energy of the impact to send him. A dead giveaway for a squad of professional soldiers, but these aren't professionals. They're conscripts, hastily drawn up from farms and villages across the Soviet Union, given ill-fitting uniforms that often leave them suffering from frostbite or just dead from the extreme cold, and thrown into a disorganized, inept offensive in the dead of winter. His next shot catches one of the men firing blindly straight in the head. He had meant to kill him fourth, but the fool was getting lucky, and rounds were starting to fall near Simo's position. He has little fear of actually being seen. He spent hours in the dead of night building his killing cave, a hard-packed hole in the snow that completely encompasses him. The hard-packed snow helps muffle the rifle and steady it. He allows the falling snow to accumulate over and around him and helps hide the signs of the hardpack he surrounds himself with. But he constantly brushes away the falling snow from directly in front of him. That way the rifle doesn't cause the telltale puff of snow with each shot. Bam! The next shot catches the man he meant to kill second in the upper chest again. It's a clean kill, just like he was taught as a kid hunting deer, wolves, and other wild game. They might be invaders and occupiers, but Simo has no wish to prolong their suffering like they truly deserve. Vengeance is another man's game. Simo's here simply doing a job and nothing more. Only a few seconds have passed since the ambush began, and the panicking soldiers have finally settled into three predictable rules. Some have thrown themselves to the ground, seeking cover in the snow. Not a bad idea, really, except the snow does little to stop or even slow Simo's bullets. Numbers 4 and 5 meet their death despite burying themselves half a foot into the snow. Others are running blindly, still unsure of which direction the firing is coming from. To their credit, some are trying to do as they've been trained, assault the ambush, but sadly they have no idea which direction the ambush is coming from. Others are simply running for what looks like solid cover. A boulder here, the remains of a fence post there. He ignores those for now. The third group is fleeing for their lives, and in a panic, the Russians break and start to rush back in the direction of friendly lines. You can't fight what you can't see, and demoralized already from the grinding war, poor equipment, and worse food, and abusive leadership, the threat of an invisible attacker is too much for them to bear, so they run. But Simo doesn't let them. More than the men seeking cover and scanning the hills for him, these runners are now his greatest threat. If one of them gets back to friendly lines and has the presence of mind to report his position, it could be a very bad day for Simo as artillery rains down around him. It won't be the first time that he's had to dig himself through an artillery barrage meant specifically for him. Normally his priority target would be the radio operator, except like most Russian units, these men aren't carrying one. It's not just squads either. He's seen entire platoons of Russian infantry operating via a system of runners. No wonder they're having such a hard time against the more mobile, flexible Finnish defenders. By the time they pin a target down and get word back to command, the Finns are already attacking from a completely different direction. It's like a bad game of whack-a-mole, playing blindfolded, and sometimes information so late by the time the artillery support comes in, it's falling right on Russian heads. And that's why it's important to get the runners first, even if it interrupts the kill order. 3 more rapid shots and there are now no more runners. Problem solved. Simo scans the survivors, clearly visible due to their brown uniforms against the white snow. He almost feels sorry for them, but he can cope with the guilt later. Now he needs to finish the job. He scans once more for any signs of a squad leader, really anyone who seems to be taking charge. Unsurprisingly, he finds nobody. The Russians have never been good about fielding a professional non-commissioned officer corps. Explains why they're so awful at maneuvering. Satisfied that nobody's coordinating the panic-stricken survivors, Simo takes a moment to refill his mouth with fresh snow. He moves slowly, steadily, and very methodically. Otherwise, he might give away his position. The occasional rifle round falls near his position from the panicked soldiers below, but he's not concerned. It'll take all the luck in the world for the amateurs below to spot his little den. The fresh mouthful of snow is vital. It cools his breath before he exhales, so it doesn't give him away with the telltale stream of steam. Ready to continue his grim work, he brings the iron sights back to his eye again. He adjusts for the rising wind and squeezes the trigger, another Russian mother who will never see her son again. He shouldn't have let a dictator send him here. Simo works slowly, methodically. Even taking shots too close together threatened to give his position away, allowing soldiers to pinpoint his location by the sound of the firing. Instead, he takes a shot, then simply waits, mentally counting up to 30 seconds. Then he repeats, over and over again until finally, only one survivor remains. This one is well protected. He hid behind a rock as the ambush began, and Simo's having a hard time getting a good beat on him. At least the Russians figured out which direction the firing's coming from, and keeps the large boulder between himself and Simo. It's now turned into a standoff with only 2 outcomes. The first is the soldier gets lucky, and another Russian squad or even armored vehicle happens by and he flags them down. That could be problematic for Simo. He's certainly not equipped to deal with an armored vehicle, and taking on an additional squad would be an issue. Even if he doesn't run out of ammo first, sheer numbers will likely overwhelm him. The second is that the soldier chooses to be patient and simply waits. The sun is still high in the sky, but days are short in the Finnish winter. A few more hours in darkness will cover the soldier's escape. There is a third option. Simo supposes he could just let the man go. There's already 11 fresh corpses in the snow, slowly turning the bright white into a deep crimson. What's the 12th? Is killing just one more invader really going to end the war? These are the internal struggles Simo details in his private memoirs, hidden from the world until years after his death. He calls it his Book of Sins, a personal and detailed account of the 500-plus soldiers that after the war he'll estimate ended up dead because of him and his rifle. He doesn't bother justifying. He's already killed so many people it's pointless, really. Instead, he decides and then acts. His first shot strikes the boulder near the top. Predictably, the impact of the bullet causes the boulder to crack and send fine slivers of razor-sharp granite exploding outwards. The soldier catches a few to the face and rears back instinctively. That's all Simo needs. The second shot ends the Russian's life. But it's not a clean kill. It couldn't be. He had only 2 inches, maybe 2.5 inches of exposed skull to work with. Instead of an immediate kill by penetrating deep into the brain, the bullet struck the upper layers of the brain and shore them away as it exited out of the upper back of the skull. This sends the soldier flying on his back and immediately begins to convulse as the brain tries to cope with the massive damage it just suffered. Simo curses and forgets to regulate his breathing, letting out a brief wisp of steam. This isn't right. Kills should be clean, whether they're on prey animals or on invaders. He tries to readjust for a killing shot, but the boulder's still between him and the slowly dying man. The only parts of him visible to Simo are an arm and a leg, both convulsing as the brain struggles to process electrical signals to the muscles, neither of which allow Simo to achieve his mercy kill. There's nothing he can do for him. A full minute and a half later, the Russian is finally still. Simo curses again and apologizes to the dead soldier, or maybe it's to God. Later, he'll have time for regret and repentance, but now he has to remain calm and alert. The entire exchange seems to have gone on for days, but it's barely lasted longer than 15 minutes. Most of the killing was in the first few minutes. Then the rest was just a lot of waiting and mopping up. Now is not the time to drop his guard, though. He might not be able to see any more Soviet soldiers before him, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. It's been at least 2 weeks since the domestic newspapers started running stories about him. The Finnish newspapers call him the White Death. The Russian newspapers don't report on him at all, especially not on the staggering number of casualties he'd helped inflict on the occupiers. Later in life, rumors will circulate that it was the Russians who gave him the nickname the White Death, but in reality it was always the Finnish propaganda construction. To add to his mystique, the papers add additional titles such as the Magic Shooter, implying that his bullets can pierce even tank armor to achieve their one-shot, one-kill lethality. The Russian newspapers might not be running stories about him and his soaring kill counts, but that doesn't mean they aren't extremely aware of him and his actions. In fact, intelligence intercepts have confirmed that the Russians have dispatched their own snipers looking to eliminate him. It's these he's now carefully scanning the countryside for. When the war first began, he would have never dreamt that the Russians would use an entire squad of young conscripts as bait just to kill one enemy sniper. But after months of fighting, he's witnessed Soviet tactics for himself. Often they send hundreds of conscripts to their deaths against Finnish machine guns and artillery just so their more veteran troops can have an easier go at it in the follow-up attack. The Russians are fighting a war of attrition in the purest form, their men eating up Finnish bullets until all magazines and cartridges are exhausted. This is largely because they're simply too tactically incompetent to do much else. If Stalin is popular at home, he's more popular than ever with the Finnish military. Unfortunately, though, Finland is a fraction the size of the Soviet Union and the tactic is working. Today, Simo is concerned that the ambush was entirely too easy. These men were sacrificial lambs. The day is silent, except for the distant sounds of tanks rumbling along somewhere miles away. Simo remains perfectly still. Snipers can't remain in one position for long or they'll become easy prey to artillery or counter snipers, so most snipers will make their escape or reposition immediately after eliminating targets. Simo, however, stays absolutely still, maintaining the same careful discipline that's kept him alive for weeks on the front, even as he's penetrated deep behind enemy lines to go hunting. His position is good. He's situated on the downslope of a large hill where he spent several hours last night digging himself into the snow. He's avoided the tree line and the cover it provides only because he was establishing his position in the dead of night. The snow had begun to fall again. Once Simo was dug in sufficiently, the fresh layer of snow would erase all signs of digging. The downslope position has 2 advantages. First, it makes the few parts of him that are visible more difficult to see thanks to the sun casting a shadow over his part of the hill. Second, as the falling snow creates new snowdrifts, they fall down on the slope and over his position, helping camouflage him further. But he picked this specific hill for a third reason. The winter sun sets quickly this time of year, and as it does, it will fall mostly behind him. That means anyone hunting for him will be forced to do so with the sun in their eyes. All Simo has to do is wait patiently and maintain his incredible discipline. His body aches to move and stretch after 6 hours of laying perfectly still, but he shoves those thoughts out of his mind as he continues to carefully scan the surrounding countryside for a threat he instinctively feels is there. Something, a sixth sense, has him on edge. When the growing hunger becomes difficult to ignore, he doesn't deny himself the way other snipers might. Denying yourself food often leads to becoming shaky, throwing your accuracy off. Instead, he carries small pieces of bread and sugar cubes in his pockets. He moves slowly, deliberately, almost imperceptibly to remove the sugar cube and put it in his mouth. The effort takes him half an hour to complete. So slow and minuscule are his movements. The sugar cube is dissolved in a fraction of that time, but the boost of energy is enough to keep the shakes away. Crows have begun to work at the bodies down below. He doesn't dare check his watch, but instead gauges how much time has passed by the lengthening of shadows. 3, maybe 4 hours since the ambush, and still nothing. But he can't shake the feeling of being hunted. Something is telling him death is out there, waiting for him to make one mistake. Maybe it's a sixth sense, or maybe it's just his knowledge that in his position, that's exactly what he would do. The lives of 12 men in exchange for the life of one? With Simo's count approaching 200, it's difficult for him to deny it's a fair exchange. He stayed alive by always planning for all possible contingencies though, including this one. The ambush location wasn't chosen at random, and as the sun starts to set in the sky, the reason why becomes clear. With the sun now behind him, it's firmly in the eyes of any would-be hunter, and more importantly, there. The hunt is over in less than a second. That's the benefit of not using a scope. It narrows your field of view too much. It's nice for picking out details, but too many snipers spend their short lives staring down the lens of their scope and missing out on the bigger picture. Not Simo. Using only his old rifle's iron sights, he immediately spots the telltale glint of an enemy's scope in movement, searching and scanning for him. A few pounds of trigger pressure later, and the duel is complete. He must have killed the Russian immediately because he hears no scream. The only thing that gives the well-hidden enemy sniper away now is the rapidly growing patch of crimson in the fresh white snow. But Simo still doesn't move. His only celebration is a fresh mouthful of snow in order to continue cooling his breath and prevent his position being given away by steam. It's discipline more than accuracy that keeps a sniper alive. He eliminated one hunter, but there could be others. Minutes turn to an hour. Simo doesn't move. With the sun only 20 minutes from fully setting, it happens. He hears the telltale sign of roaring, distant artillery. The sound is quickly followed by the screaming, high-pitched whine of incoming rounds that smash into a grove of trees to his right. So there was another sniper. Only with the sun starting to set, he knew his hunt was running out of time. Having failed to locate Simo, the Russian finally caved and simply called for an artillery strike in the general area, hoping to kill him before the cover of night allowed him to slip away once more. The artillery rocks the hill and surrounding trees. Much of it's falling onto the grove of trees to his right, and after that's been turned into matchsticks, rounds start falling to the trees on his left. The fire's being guided by the enemy sniper, who's eliminating all the most probable hiding spots. He'd never dreamed Simo was hiding in plain view the entire time. Yet another reason a good sniper never picks the obvious spots. That doesn't mean that he's safe though, as artillery is notoriously inaccurate. A round proves this point by smashing into the snow a few hundred feet below Simo, throwing up massive plumes of snow. He can hear the angry buzzing of razor-sharp shrapnel spraying into the snow around him. He stays cool though, all the time scanning for the enemy sniper. Panicking now would be a death sentence, as the moment he gets up to run for it, even under the cover of incoming rounds, he has no doubt that the Russian will take his shot. This isn't the first time the Russians have tried artillery in frustration, and it won't be the last. The barrage continues 15 minutes after the skies turn dark. Rounds come uncomfortably close, but the falling snow plumes only help to add to Simo's camouflage. The enemy has used artillery to sweep across the landscape in broad strokes, leaving little standing in its wake. Even the bodies below have been ravaged by incoming rounds or torn to shreds by high-speed shrapnel. Yet Simo remains, and when it becomes clear that more rounds aren't incoming, he makes his move. There's still a low fog of snow in the air from all the thick plumes kicked up by the incoming artillery, and this, along with the cover of darkness, give him all the cover he needs to make his escape. Simo avoids the actual crest of the hill where he'll be highlighted against the stars and dancing lights of the far northern sky. Instead, he moves along the military crest, parallel to the battlefield below him, heading into cover of the twisted and splintered trees. Once there, he follows the curve of the hill to a narrow valley where he'll be covered from observation on all sides. He picked his escape route as carefully as his firing position, not leaving a single detail to chance. In minutes, he left his old position and a frustrated enemy sniper behind, and within an hour, he'll be back behind friendly lines. He takes pains to announce his approach to friendly lines through a predetermined position that's been told to expect him and several other scout snipers dispatched the evening before. Entering the camp, his commanding officer gives him a cursory nod. The man looks exhausted, spent after another day of repelling another fierce Russian assault. The Russians have the numbers, but the Finns have the superior defensive positions and fighting spirit. They're proving a very difficult nut to crack. "It's good you did not die, Simo," his superior remarks weirdly as he points him in the direction of a hot meal, a rare luxury on the front. "Was it a good hunt?" Simo simply nods, gives a quick figure of total enemy KIA. Not all kills can be verified independently, but Simo is a humble man, even in the midst of war. There's little reason to doubt his grim figures, especially because, unlike others, he takes no pleasure in any of them. It's simply his duty, carried out without hatred or malice against the men who invaded his country. And the moment they pack up and leave, he'll stop killing them. Until then, though, he continues his hunt, killing as many of them as possible before he himself is killed in return. Simo has no idea that in less than 4 months he'll earn the title of history's deadliest sniper, with the highest body count in history, 259 confirmed kills and over 500 unconfirmed. Then again, he is operating in a target-rich environment against an enemy who lacks discipline, motivation, or even proper winter equipment. Simo's body count, or his tally of sins as you'll view it later in life, is more a testament to the evil of dictators than to his own competency. But that's not to say that Simo Hayat is truly one of history's deadly snipers, and there are 13 fresh Russian corpses to prove the fact. For now, he tucks into his hot meal and mentally reviews the actions of the day, seeking for ways he could have improved his efficiency further, probing his actions for any tactical weaknesses he can eliminate in the future. His mind is always working, always preparing for the next day's actions, even as it also longs for peace. Osama bin Laden, the world's most wanted man. Not only did he pull off a devastating strike against the US homeland, but he managed to avoid capture and survive for a decade afterwards. What went wrong? And how did this notorious terrorist manage to avoid justice for so long? Turns out that the answer goes back to even before the infamous attacks. Born in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden wasn't some downtrodden underdog who became a terrorist. He grew up in luxury as the son of a billionaire construction magnate. So, how did he get radicalized? It all started when he joined Pakistani forces fighting against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But he didn't develop his unabiding hatred for the US until the Gulf War, where he saw American troops stationed on Saudi soil. So he viewed it as a desecration of the holy Muslim land. Even though the countries were allies, it didn't matter. He was determined to get revenge, and soon would form the Al-Qaeda terror group that would target US interests abroad and at home. And he didn't get a welcome reception at home. His radicalism led to him being expelled from Saudi Arabia and losing his citizenship. So he became a stateless figure looking to hide in any country that supported his cause. His first attack was in Yemen in 1992, where his team bombed a hotel full of US troops. It detonated prematurely, killing 2 civilians in the parking lot. A year later, the World Trade Center in New York was hit by a bomb in the parking garage, killing 6 people. While bin Laden was never proven to be involved, the mastermind of the attack trained in Al-Qaeda camps. And 2 years later, a car bomb exploded at a military base in Saudi Arabia, killing 7 people, including 5 Americans. Bin Laden was on the US radar now, but where was he? At this point, he was hiding out in the African nation of Sudan, which was known to be friendly to Islamic fundamentalists. But the government still had good relations with the United States, and Osama bin Laden came up in conversations between officials and the CIA. Did they offer to hand him over? It's not clear, but what is clear is that the US sniffing around his bases in that country led to bin Laden fleeing at some point, heading to his new home base in Afghanistan. Not that he told anyone. Al-Qaeda maintained a presence in Sudan, which would fool investigators for some time, and he was about to step up his operation in a big way. Until now, Al-Qaeda's attacks had been relatively small-scale, with only a few succeeding, but they were about to enter the realm of coordinated attacks, causing much greater damage. Starting with a duo of truck bombs in Kenya and Tanzania, hitting US embassies in both countries in 1998. 12 Americans were killed, but the vast majority of the deaths, over 200, were locals. This was the first time most Americans had heard of Al-Qaeda, and the public wanted revenge. President Bill Clinton wasted no time in responding, but the response wouldn't have the desired effect. Operation Infinite Reach was a series of cruise missile attacks on Afghanistan and Sudan, targeting Al-Qaeda training camps. This was the first official military engagement against a non-state actor, with many anti-war activists claiming it was an illegitimate attack because the US wasn't at war with either of the nations. However, bin Laden wasn't killed by the attacks, and overall Operation Infinite Reach became a propaganda win for the extremist. This was shortly after the radical Taliban group took over Afghanistan, and the militant clerics refused to hand over bin Laden and deepened their ties with him. And so the war of attrition continued. Having proven he could hit big targets, bin Laden's next goal was to sink a U.S. ship. He would make his first attempt in early 2000, but the heavy bomb on the small boat derailed it, and it never reached its goal. He learned from that error and delivered a deadly payload to the USS Cole in October 2000, killing 17 sailors. The attack may have influenced the election in the US the following month, but it was only a prelude to what would come less than a year later. Osama bin Laden was still seen as a minor threat, but that was about to change. The September 11, 2001 attacks were the first major attack on the US mainland by al-Qaeda, and the deadliest attack on US soil since Pearl Harbor. 2 hijacked planes took down the World Trade Center, and a third hit the Pentagon, killing everyone on board. A 4th plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, and it was later revealed that that 4th plane was meant to hit the U.S. Capitol. Osama bin Laden was now public enemy number 1, and new President George W. Bush demanded justice. He announced to the world that the Taliban needed to hand bin Laden over now, and the Taliban's response was to demand U.S. ambassadors be sent to negotiate. Given the Taliban's history of taking hostages, this was rejected immediately. The war on terror had officially begun. The U.S. began bombing Afghanistan only days after the attacks, with one of their primary goals being to hunt down bin Laden. But where was he? He favored isolated safe houses, moving frequently and traveling with his wives and close associates. Now he sent his wives across the border to Pakistan and traveled from one Taliban-controlled safe house to another. A few months after the war began, he moved to the isolated Tora Bora region, where he was near impossible to find due to the rough terrain and the sparsely populated area with few sources to draw on. It would be a long war of attrition from here. Bin Laden didn't give up on attacking the U.S., but he would never pull off another major attack on the U.S. mainland. Only 2 months after that attack, the infamous shoe bomber Richard Reed attempted to blow up a plane from Paris to Miami, but failed to successfully ignite the explosives and was restrained on the plane. Security increased massively in the U.S. after the attacks, and bin Laden's options became limited. He would pull off attacks around the world in less secure locations, but now he was on the defensive. But that didn't mean he was done. Osama bin Laden was the most wanted man in the world. The country he was hiding in was being bombed by the most powerful country in the world. The U.S. government agents were scouting the country trying to hunt him down, and a $25 million bounty had been placed on his head. Despite that, years would go by without any sign of him. Some people speculated that he had been killed in the initial bombings, but occasionally grainy videos of him threatening new attacks would surface. Were these body doubles designed to keep the propaganda alive? No one was sure, but the U.S. kept up the hunt. It would be a long, slow mission, and the true extent of it wouldn't become clear until he was finally found. For most of the time, the U.S. looked for bin Laden in Afghanistan, but that turned out to be a red herring. Afghanistan was the most sympathetic nation to bin Laden, but it was also quickly descending into anarchy. And soon the Taliban would be replaced by a U.S.-friendly government led by Hamid Karzai that created a rudimentary democracy, albeit one that had to fend off attacks from the Taliban forces for its entire duration. But bin Laden can no longer count on the Taliban to shield him, so a year after the 9/11 attacks, he traveled with his family across the border into a mountainous region of Pakistan. They moved from safe house to safe house for several years before moving to Abbottabad, where he would build his secret compound. So why did the U.S. not clue in on this sooner? Unlike Afghanistan, Pakistan was ostensibly a U.S. ally. The U.S. was hesitant to anger their government because maintaining good relations with the nuclear power and being able to serve as a mediator for India and Pakistan was important. But Pakistan wasn't being forthcoming about what they knew about bin Laden's presence on their soil, and so the U.S. had to rely on third-party sources. The regions where bin Laden stayed were dangerous, and any U.S. soldier caught there couldn't rely on support from Pakistan's government, and the U.S. would likely not be able to rescue them without a diplomatic scandal forming. So, information coming out of those regions was spotty for several years, and bin Laden was able to stay under the radar in Pakistan for all those years, but not forever. The U.S. had to rely on unconventional sources of information for years, including the many detainees they'd captured and held at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. This military prison camp held hundreds of al-Qaeda soldiers, as well as many people who claimed to just be people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it could be difficult to tell who was who. But amid the sea of interrogations, many of which led to dead ends, one name showed up: Abu Ahmed al-Kawati, a man who was supposedly a courier working for bin Laden. It's not known when the officials first got the tip that he was working for bin Laden, but by 2007 they discovered the man's real name, Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed. the government now had its first real link to bin Laden's whereabouts. It would be a multi-year process to find the courier and his location, with it taking almost 2 years to discover his name to find his hometown, Abbottabad. The US was hesitant to make any moves in Pakistan until it knew more, but now it had a location, and Abbottabad was isolated enough that they could start sending in paramilitary operatives without arousing the suspicion of the Pakistani government. Over the next year, they'd follow Ahmed on his daily missions and track him repeatedly, making an appearance at a surprisingly secure compound that seemed out of place in the mountain town. But even this didn't give them what they needed. The CIA was able to set up a surveillance in the area and take countless shots of the compound. They were able to determine that it was a fortress designed to hide someone of significance. They saw many people coming in and out, but there was only one person they didn't see: Osama bin Laden. If he was inside, he was taking his security very seriously and had not left the compound in a long time. Neither had anyone known to be a member of his family. Not surprising, as his wives and children likely had very little autonomy. But based on the many guests, the CIA's best guess was that he was still living there with his youngest wives. But before they made a move, they needed proof. So began one of the most devious schemes in the operation. How do you get a notoriously paranoid and secretive terror leader to open his front door to you? Simple. You create a face that no reasonable or unreasonable person could object to. The United States recruited Dr. Shakil Afridi to approach the compound, claiming to be running a vaccination drive. With the help of some nurses, they were able to gain access to the compound to vaccinate the children, and also take some DNA samples that would potentially identify members of the bin Laden clan. It's not clear if the DNA ever did make its way to the US and provide the final piece of the puzzle, but when Dr. Afridi's role in the manhunt came out, he would become one of Pakistan's most wanted men. No good deed goes unpunished. Now all that was left was scouting out the location. The compound was massive, located on a lot around 8 times the size of the largest houses in Abbottabad. While the actual house wasn't too large, the security ballooned it to many times its size, surrounded by concrete walls up to 18 feet wide and topped with barbed wire. The only way in was through security gates, and there was no way to do digital spying on the compound because there was no internet or phone service on the base. So anyone hoping bin Laden would hack into some unsecured Wi-Fi was going to be disappointed. The third-floor balcony had an additional 7-foot wall shielding it from the public eye, and not even trash left the compound. The residents would regularly bury it. The compound was set for a war, and that's what it would get. But back home, it was a very different story. While Osama bin Laden was public enemy number 1 after the 9/11 attacks, soon he faded from the headlines. George W. Bush, who vowed to get bin Laden dead or alive, soon got distracted and launched a war to displace dictator Saddam Hussein in Iraq. He was re-elected, but the second half of his presidency would be defined by mounting casualties in Iraq, a devastating hurricane, and a terrible financial crisis in 2008. By that point, bin Laden had largely disappeared, and few people considered the hunt for him a top priority anymore. Bush would be replaced by liberal Barack Obama in 2009, and Obama vowed to disengage from Iraq and focus more on domestic affairs. He, too, had a troubled presidency, and his re-election was seen doubtful after his party took a shellacking in the 2010 midterms. And at this point, many people didn't even know if bin Laden was alive or dead. The US had never given up the hunt, but much of it happened far away from prying eyes. Many people initially speculated that bin Laden had died in the initial bombings or died due to illness in the ensuing years, but there wasn't any proof either way. A 2005 book interviewing al-Qaeda detainees disclosed that he had escaped from Tora Bora into Pakistan, but reports that he had a serious kidney disorder made it seem to many like he might have just quietly died far away from the public eye. The US never publicly bought into the rumors, maintaining that he was a threat, but the lack of any new information made the public start turning out. And at a certain point, he started turning from terror leader to boogeyman in many people's eyes. For most people, their only connection to Osama bin Laden during these years was ill-sourced newspaper reports. Some were credible reports of where he might be hiding, others claimed he was dead or he might have changed his identity, maybe some claimed he was hiding out in Los Angeles with Elvis and Bat Boy. And as the attacks against the US homeland stopped and everyone got used to going through metal detectors and taking off our shoes at the airports, he started seeming less like a threat and more like a past figure. The government stopped giving the public updates, and most people assumed we'd never know the truth of what happened to him, which was why everyone was surprised when the bin Laden issue roared back into the mainstream media. In the years leading up to 2011, the CIA had staked out a place in Abbottabad and used informants and technology to learn everything they could about the compound. This included a drone that mapped every element of the house they could, ensuring that the team sent in would be as well informed as possible. They also used advanced spyware and tracking devices to pick up any cell phone signals in the immediate vicinity, even if the compound itself had no technology. Ironically, the size and security of the compound might have worked against bin Laden because it was so large it could be observed from multiple angles. And after years of intelligence gathering, a decision was made. The CIA and related organizations brought their intel to the president's desk, and Barack Obama had the most impactful decision of his career awaiting him. White House counterterrorism advisor John Brennan and CIA Director Leon Panetta were heavily involved in the planning, and they developed Operation Neptune Spear as a kill or capture operation. The US had the policy of not killing any enemy who surrendered, no matter how much blood they had on their hands. But no one expected bin Laden to surrender, and everything around the operation was based on that assumption. So it sounds like an easy decision. Well, not quite. Vice Admiral William McRaven, the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, was one of the first to be briefed on the mission after the president. A veteran of special ops, he felt the commando team would be the best equipped to take out Osama bin Laden. A bombing strike wouldn't guarantee a kill, and bin Laden's body might never be identified. Plus, if there were civilian casualties, it could be seen as an act of war against Pakistan. But that was also the biggest challenge here: how to handle relations with Pakistan. No one knew how closely linked the Pakistani government was with the al-Qaeda leader. If the US government brought the intel to them and asked for a joint operation, they could get their man, or Pakistan could tip the terror leader off and allow him to disappear once again. They decided to go it alone. President Obama met with the National Security Council to hash out the details of the plan. Quickly ruling out the joint operation, Obama was hesitant to send a US team into harm's way. He seemed to favor a bombing mission at first, but the CIA said they weren't positive that there wasn't an underground bunker at the base. That meant a bombing mission might not do the job, and with little way to conduct post-mission intel, the truth might never come out. The bombs powerful enough to destroy an underground bunker would cause collateral damage, so that plan was put on hold, and instead McRaven was tasked with developing a foolproof plan for a commando raid, and it would fall on the best of the best. The Navy SEALs picked for their mission were among the most elite soldiers in the US military, most having 10 or more deployments to Afghanistan and skills including border infiltration and foreign language knowledge. They were brought in without being told the details of the mission and engaged in rehearsals of the raid in test compounds built in multiple locations. Whatever this mission was, it was big enough that the government built a massive facility just to train for it. When they were told that the government had found Osama bin Laden and it was their job to take him down, reportedly, every single one of them burst out cheering. Now that they knew the mission, they would be briefed on the last few details of the raid. They'd be flown in on modified Black Hawk helicopters designed to be quiet and nearly invisible on radar. The US had supplied much of Pakistan's military equipment and trained their soldiers, so they knew their capabilities and how to get around them, and they were confident they could counter them if they came under attack. But the goal was for Pakistan to know nothing about the raid until it was already done. If bin Laden had surrendered, he would be held at a nearby Air Force base, but that was unlikely, and the SEALs were informed that if they were captured, the government would negotiate for their release. But they wouldn't be able to send in a rescue mission. Now it all hinged on one man. Was this raid too risky? Was the president really willing to put a team of Navy SEALs behind enemy lines on what would likely be an assassination mission? If the mission succeeded, it would be the biggest foreign policy coup of the administration. But if it failed, Barack Obama's presidency would essentially be over. Meanwhile, the military brass was making final plans, including adding an additional helicopter detachment that might be able to help the team fight their way out if they were cornered. Ultimately, the president looked at the plan and gave the go-ahead for the mission that might finally rid the US of its decades-long enemy. And now it was all in the hands of the Navy SEALs. As the team took to the air and headed for Abbottabad, the president and his closest team members retreated to the Situation Room to watch the raid on closed-circuit cameras. Around 12 SEALs were making their way toward the compound, and their command was transferred to the CIA for the mission so that the US soldiers would technically not be controlled by the US Army while on Pakistani soil. They would be backed up by 67 additional commandos and a military working dog, a Belgian Malinois named Cairo, who would be tracking any escaping people from the compound and alert SEALs to any Pakistani military presence, making him a very good boy indeed. It was time. The two Black Hawk helicopters were accompanied by larger Chinook helicopters, holding back in case they were needed. The first helicopter would hover over the yard while its team rappelled to the ground, as the other copter would be around the perimeter and deploy the rest of the team plus the dog and an interpreter. But as they approached, one of the copters was hit by hazardous airflow conditions that caused it to spin out and be damaged. The pilot was able to avoid a crash, landing with some damage, but without any injuries or alerting security. They were on the ground, and now there was one thing left to do: breach the door and take on whoever was inside. My name is Sasha Yevchenko, and I'd like to tell you the story of how I survived one of the worst man-made disasters the world has ever seen. On April 25, 1986, I was working at the heart of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant when the No. 4 nuclear reactor exploded. The blast was huge in itself, and one of my colleagues was pretty much vaporized instantly. What happened after that has become one of the world's worst real-life horror stories. But let me start from the beginning. It was evening at the plant where I worked, which was located near the town of Pripyat in northern Ukraine. The sky was a radiant blue, it was warm, and when my colleagues and I clocked in for our night shift at the plant, we were in good spirits. I remember the conversation was all about what we were going to do for the May Day holidays, and little did we know the near future would be very different from how we imagined it would be. My wife Natasha was at home with my 2-year-old. I was 24 at the time, with a new family and everything to look forward to. That night, we were told that we were going to have to run a test on reactor number 4. This didn't go down well with a lot of guys because we weren't really sure how to do it. We had no choice though. A command is a command. We argued about the right power level we should start the test at, and little did we know that there was a design flaw in the reactor. This would prove to be what you might call a fatal design flaw. What we were basically testing was a simulation of an electrical power outage. You can probably guess that such a thing, if it were to happen, would be very dangerous. But if there was an outage, the generators would kick on. The problem was this would take about a minute to gain full power. And you just don't have a minute because the water that's pumped in the reactor to keep it cool would not get pumped and too much heat would be generated. So the theory was that the electricity could be taken from the rotational energy of the steam turbine. This would in theory power the cooling pumps for that minute. So to do the test, we had to simulate this power loss and see if this theory worked. We tried this twice before, but both times the tests failed. Third time lucky is not exactly how things turned out. So we dropped the power levels. That didn't go well, and suddenly the reactor became dangerously unstable. We also ignored, and were told to ignore, some of the vital safety mechanisms. We knew something was wrong, but we were told to go ahead and keep testing. We removed something called control rods so that we could get back the power, but that didn't turn out well either. It was also against safety procedures. Those rods are like a failsafe. They prevent the reactor from generating too much power. Power then began to rise, and then rise dramatically. We weren't sure what was happening. In the reactor, steam was building up. You could say what we had then was a pressure cooker of enormous proportions. We knew then we had an emergency on our hands. We pushed the scram button, which was the emergency shutdown. We then reinserted the control rods, but they jammed. What we didn't know is that the graphite tips on those rods caused more power to surge. At 1:23:45 a.m., the pressure cooker then blew. The 1,000-ton roof was blown right off and a fireball blasted into the sky. The air was filled with dust. Pieces of graphite were flung everywhere. Radiation spilled into the atmosphere. It was hell on Earth in the literal sense. We were all shocked in the room. The boom was so big we thought a war had happened. The walls shuddered. The whole place felt so unstable. Trust me, I'm a huge man and I'm not afraid of much, but at that point, I felt tiny, at the mercy of something terrible. I then went looking for my buddy because he must have been closest to the explosion. It was dark in the corridors, dust was everywhere. All I could hear was a hissing sound. He'd been too near the pumps. He was dead. I saw the roof had been blown off, and in the night sky I could see the stars. And then I saw something that looked quite wonderful, ethereal, like God shining down on us. It was a beam of light. That beam was something more malign than I was aware of. It was radiation, and that radiation would kill a lot of people. I then went with some colleagues to the reactor hall, but the heavy door was jammed. As I said, I'm a big man. Some people say a bear of a man. I managed to get the door open while my friends went inside the hall and tried to understand just how much damage had been caused. Those guys would all die in the coming days and weeks from radiation poisoning. At the time, we knew radiation levels were high because the device used to tell us the level, the dosimeter, was showing a needle that was off the scale. Still, at the time, all we thought was there goes our job in the nuclear energy business. We had no idea of just how catastrophic that explosion was. After about an hour, though, I knew something was wrong, and I mean wrong with me. I started to throw up, and then I got a sore throat. Outside, firefighters were already on the scene. They didn't know either about the dangerous levels of radiation, and many of those brave guys would die slow, horrible deaths. In the town nearby, people stood outside, mesmerized by this great big beam of light. Some of those people would also die from radiation poisoning. But as I said, no one really knew about the danger they were in. I had a good idea as time went on, because at about 6 a.m. I couldn't even walk. I felt deathly ill. The Grim Reaper of radiation was inside of me, slowly trying to relieve me of my life, my kid, my loving wife. I was taken to the hospital, and there a few of us talked about what was happening to us, just how much radiation had we been exposed to. One guy seemed to know what he was talking about, and he said if you throw up like that so quickly, well, it's a lot. We might even die. In fact, I later learned that vomiting after radiation poisoning means death for most people. I found out I'd been exposed to 4.1 sievert of radiation. You don't know what that means, of course, but let me tell you that it was about 650 times above the level that workers at a nuclear plant should get exposed, not in an hour, but in a year. It's 5,000 times more than the average person should be exposed to in a whole year. I knew I was in trouble. Some of these guys I talked to at the hospital died horribly. In a way, you could say they melted from the inside. Then, things got more surreal when the KGB came to the hospital and started to talk to me. I was then told I had to go to Moscow, and that's where they took me without even informing my wife. 128 of us made that trip, and I believe 5 people in this group died. I mean, died soon, of course. God knows who died as a result of being poisoned in the years to come. I got to Moscow, and one of the first things they did to me was shave my head. This was no time to care about appearances, and anyway, in a week, all my body hair just fell out. Most of us were having trouble breathing. Our eyes hurt, our noses hurt, everything seemed to hurt. Then we were given bone marrow transplants. I had many, in fact. What's really weird and chilling is the fact that me and a lot of guys suddenly felt a lot better. What we didn't know was with radiation poisoning at such high levels, there's kind of a rest period, a hiatus in the chaos happening inside. You think you're getting better, but then the worst stuff starts to happen. For me, a low point was pulling back my bed sheets one day and seeing my ulcerous skin dead. The worst parts of me were my shoulders, my hip, my calf. And that's because when I held that door, those parts were exposed to really high levels of radiation. Had I gone inside, well, that would have been game over for me. Parts of my body just seemed to be eaten alive. Bits of me just turned black. It was awful to see. I was turning into a monster, a kind of radioactive mutant. But I was lucky. I went through my operations and had lots of skin grafts. I wasn't dead, but when I was told I might lose my arm, I was a bit upset. They saved it, but it stayed covered in bandages for the next 7 years of my life. Even these days, I might occasionally see ulcerations on the parts of my skin that were most exposed to the radiation. One of the things that saved me was the fact that they sent me to Berlin to have microsurgery, where blood vessels were transferred from my leg to my arm. Like I said, I was lucky. I'm a fortunate man. One of those guys that worked close to me had similar surgeries. He went blind, and then within a month of his exposure, he died. What had happened to him and to the rest of us is bone marrow cells had been destroyed from the radiation, and this caused a drop in white blood cells. When that happens, you can't fight off infection, and that's when you slowly start to be eaten alive from within. I spent in total 1 year inside hospitals, and then for years after I had to regularly go back for rehab. They told me I shouldn't have another child, because the chances of that child developing leukemia were very high. Now and again I get morbid and think, when will the worst happen? But so far, my good old body has been excellent at repairing itself. My wife has stood by me, and it wasn't easy at times. People knew about what had happened to me and thought I was a walking time bomb. They'd cross the street when they saw me because they thought I'd passed the poison onto them. I was one of the monsters of Chernobyl to them, walking around with a radiation hazard sign on my back. But I'm here and I'm happy. I think I can now safely say that I survived Chernobyl. My name is Sasha Yevchenko, and that's my story. Being isolated at home can be rough on a person, and now many of you viewers know that from firsthand experience. But imagine if you had to spend your entire life in quarantine. Imagine if every day invisible pathogens threatened to take your life away, pathogens that were harmless to other people because they were naturally protected against them. You are a special case indeed, and there will be no contact or cuddles with other people for as long as you live. You'll never feel the touch of another person's skin, not even your own mother's. You're a walking time bomb. The very planet is your predator. The air is pervasive with invisible threats that lay in wait to finish you off. Welcome to the life of a bubble boy. The bubble boy we are talking about was named David Vetter. He was born September 21st, 1971, but he wasn't his mother's first child. That first child died after 7 months, and the reason was because he was born with something called Severe Combined Immunodeficiency, or SCID. We're gonna get into details later about what that actually is, but first let's get back to the story of David. After those parents lost their first child to this very rare disease, they were told that if they should have another child, there was a good chance it could also be born with SCID. The couple already had a healthy girl, and so they thought they'd go ahead and try to have another baby. As soon as baby David came out of his mother, he entered the world of isolation. He was under attack from the moment he was delivered, and so had to be confined inside a specially made cocoon bed that had been sterilized. This was now David's world, although in the years to come, that cocoon would get larger, of course. If David had not been cocooned, within months his body would have become infected by various diseases, and those would overwhelm and kill him. The outcome wasn't good for SCID kids. But David didn't give up the ghost easily. He grew up and was able to walk and talk, but his entire life would be inside a chamber. He was never hugged like all children should be. He didn't get to go out and play or go to school, so you might just be wondering how he survived when he could have no contact with the outside world. How did the poor guy even eat? Okay, so first a 101 on what David had and why he had to literally live in a bubble. Severe combined immunodeficiency. What's that? It doesn't sound too good. As you can probably guess, it means that a person is born with virtually no immunity to anything. You see, you guys watching the show might not know that inside of you there is a battle going on. You have soldiers on your side fighting for you all the time, night and day, 24/7, until the day you bite the dust. This immune defense system of yours is your heavenly protector, your biological knight in shining armor, because when it detects foreign agents, let's call them enemies, it defends you against them. These invading pathogens are detected as the enemy, and so your immune system responds. And this is happening all the time, but sometimes your defense system has to put up a fight, and you might feel quite ill. Sometimes you didn't win the battle, and that's you, gone, dead, you've pooped your clogs, as the British might say. That's why some folks with compromised immune systems might not fight off infections very well. We're speaking in layman's terms here, of course, because this is a show not about biology, it's a show about David. You see, David wasn't born with this built-in defense system that you have. He wasn't what you just might call a sickly child. He was virtually under attack from everything that existed in the world. He didn't have a compromised immune system. His entire army was MIA. Our world, you see, is full of microorganisms, and some of those can hurt us, organisms we call pathogens. That word basically means disease producing. They are everywhere, and you are completely fudged if you can't fight them at all. That's why David had to live in a bubble. But how did that go? Well, all the time David was in his bubble, his parents hoped and prayed he could have a bone marrow transplant, but he needed the perfect match. Getting that wasn't easy, so he had to maintain his life in the bubble. His sister was his great hope at first, since it was thought her bone marrow would be the right fit, but unfortunately it wasn't. You see, if a transplant is successful, the body will produce white blood cells, and then the immune system will kick in. So David just had to wait. Meanwhile, this is how life in the bubble was. He needed to eat and drink, of course, but anything sent into that bubble had to be sterilized. You might ask, how do you sterilize a cheese and ham sandwich? Well, there were holes in the bubble, so as a kid, nurses could wear gloves and spoon feed him. He ate only food from jars and cans, and that food had to be sterilized. Everything that went in the chamber had to be sterilized. There were no sandwiches, unfortunately. The process of sterilization didn't just involve wiping stuff down with alcohol or detergent, but putting all the items in a special chamber, then pumping that chamber with ethylene oxide gas at a high temperature. The item would then be aerated for 1 to 7 days, and then it could be put into David's bubble. So he had food, he had toys, he had TVs and books, you name it, but all those things had to go through this sterilization process. And the guy had to breathe, of course, so air was pumped into the bubble. The problem with that was the generator was really noisy, so talking to David could be hard, not to mention how he must have felt with that constant noise in his life. In time, he did at least get amplifiers to make communication easier. His parents gave him an education. They showed him love, but in a non-contact kind of way. His sister even slept next to the bubble, so David always had company. He'd even fight with her at times, as siblings do. One time, he reached out of his bubble with his gloves on and tried to punch her. He was too slow to make contact, something that irked the confined child. It was hard for the boy. He couldn't go out and play like the other kids. There was one instance when his sister announced that he was going to get a burger from the local fast food place, and David shouted, "I want to go!" And then he thought for a while and said, "No, I don't." He spent a lot of time at a hospital and a lot of time at home, so you might be wondering just how he got from place to place. His bubble was too big for a car or a van, and just a short trip outside the bubble would have killed him. Well, he had a transport bubble, and even went to the movie theater in it once and watched Return of the Jedi. Better still, when David was 6, NASA made him a kind of spacesuit, albeit one connected to his bubble with a tube. He got to walk about a bit and feel a little more like a human. But it seems he didn't quite like it, and after about 7 times in the suit, he just said he didn't want to wear it anymore. As he got older, of course, he matured in his mind. At 11 years old, he was no longer a little kid, but a big kid. And seeing as he was always on TV, he became aware that he was a bit of a star. Was that a good thing, though? Some people think it wasn't, because his life was a bit like The Truman Show. In fact, while he always smiled for the cameras, we know that sometimes he went into fits of rages when they were turned off. He didn't want to be a goldfish in a bowl, a kind of weird roadside attraction for millions of Americans. The kid matured and he wanted out, but there was no way out. Why, he would think, has life dealt me such an awful hand? We should say there had been boys in bubbles in the past, but never had someone got so old in a bubble. The bubble was no place for a teenager, and so when David was 12, he finally was given that bone marrow transplant he so direly needed. The doctors decided to try a new technique and give him a bone marrow transplant that wasn't a perfect match. His beloved sister was the donor, and in October it happened. For 4 months, David seemed okay, although still in his bubble. Things quickly went wrong though, because his sister had passed a virus onto him, the Epstein-Barr virus. Most of you have this virus in you, but it lies dormant. At the time, the doctor couldn't screen her for the virus. It attacked David and he couldn't fight it. Infections overwhelmed his body, and he ended up falling very ill from a cancer of the lymphatic system. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital and finally freed from his bubble, experiencing the real world, touching the skin of his family, able to breathe real air, to finally live without the hum of a machine in the background. He actually asked for a Coke, something that couldn't be sterilized for his bubble life, but the doctors refused him on the grounds that it wouldn't help his condition. But he kissed his mother for the first time in his life. She would sit down beside him and comb his hair, an experience that was both sad and wonderful. He was out of his prison, but fading fast. He was truly alive at least, but not long for this world. The slings and arrows of outrageous fortune had finally done him in. On February 22, 1984, he was still conscious, but he knew his time was coming. He made jokes that morning, but as if an angel had whispered in his ear, he winked at his doctor, closed his eyes, and slipped into unconsciousness. If you believe this kind of thing, his bubble is now the infinite majesty of the universe. He's no longer confined, but immortal, and forever loved by those whose feelings he touched. This writer doesn't mind admitting it, but he's feeling a bit choked up right now. A 20-year-old man, a man who believes he has become a victim of the justice system in the US, wants out. In the psych ward where he's been placed, he bides his time until he sees his chance to get into a medical cabinet. The man has no problem picking locks. He'll pick many locks for many years to come. Inside that cabinet is a bottle of the extremely potent psychotropic substance called LSD. He takes the bottle of that, and again, when the time is right, he sneaks into the staff room and pours the entire bottle into a pot of boiling coffee. The incoming and outgoing staff are all gonna get a hit you could call heroic. In his own words, the man later said, "The plan was when all the people were freaked out enough, I was going to pick the locks and go." A few aides and staff on the ward between them unwittingly took acid to the amount of around 100 tabs. Perhaps you're not the type of person who knows much about things like LSD, but let us tell you, 100 tabs between a handful of people would have caused them to hallucinate wildly. The plan didn't exactly go how that guy wanted it to go. Far from it. Not long after those coffees were drunk, one aide was down in the basement watching the clothes dryer spin around and around. His pupils were now large black shimmering discs, and he stared at that spinning drum and just lost his mind. The machine became his mortal enemy. The aide screamed at the dryer, he threw punches at it, kicked it. While upstairs in the ward, people were tripping out of their minds. One of the female psychiatric doctors didn't seem to know where she was or who she was. She was seen madly dancing up and down the ward and, in a sexually suggestive way, informing the shocked inmates about how deliriously hot she was feeling. The scene was a phantasmagoria of horror and comedy. But during all that utter madness, the plotter and executor of that communal trip could not make his escape. Security was soon called and the staff were taken to some place to calm down from their mega trip. A clothes dryer had been ripped apart and, in one man's eyes, defeated. Welcome to the life of Mark DeFreist, the Houdini of Florida, a masterful escape artist, a veritable genius who just couldn't find his way in life. A life that from the outside might look part comedy, but in reality His life sentence on this earth has been filled mostly with devastating tragedy. Mark was born in 1960 and grew up with his father and stepmom. His father had served during the Second World War in the OSS, an organization that would later evolve into the CIA. Father and son were close, and the former imparted his vast knowledge to the latter. This would serve Mark well in his many prison escapes. But the child was different. Some say he was a savant. Most others now say he was a high-functioning autistic, and still is today. Mark didn't understand much about the world and didn't socialize much with other kids. He spent most of his time by himself, and he despised school. They moved him to a disciplinary boys' school to temper the child's waywardness, but he ran away, something he would keep doing his entire life. All he really wanted to do was take things apart and put them back together again. At the back of the house, there was a workshop, something Mark would later call his Frankenstein's lab. There, he would mess around with chemicals, blowing himself up on 2 occasions, and he would rewire appliances, take apart clocks, all with the skill and dexterity of a seasoned expert. His life fell apart when he was 19. His father died, and knowing what Mark loved most, he bequeathed all his tools to him. This was the start of the beginning of tragedy because Mark, not really knowing how wills work, took the tools before that will had been probated. That just means made valid. His cold and stony stepmother, a woman who had never cared for Mark, called the cops. Those cops chased Mark down one night, and on seeing those flashing lights, this young man who didn't quite get how things worked in society fled on foot. He had no idea why those cops were after him. He had no idea about how wills were supposed to be dealt with. He was arrested and charged with theft, and also got a charge for being in possession of a weapon. Next came jail. This just didn't seem fair to the young man, a guy that thought he'd taken what was rightly his. One day after Bible study class, he and the other inmates were being led back to their cells, when some men just started running for it, heading to the razor wire fence. None of them got over, but Mark knew exactly how to scale such a fence because his father once taught him how it could be done. Mark then hotwired a car, hit the road, and settled into a motel for the night. This was his problem. He understood the technical aspects related to escape, but he didn't have the nous, the worldliness, the social intellect to evade the authorities for long. He got 6 more charges after that. He went back to jail, where he was jumped by 14 inmates who didn't quite understand this weird kid, who didn't fit in but wasn't afraid to talk back to them. Those 14 so-called tough guys beat him badly and sexually abused him. After that, Mark slit his wrists. He hit his head against the cell door. He screamed and shouted all day long, and soon he was taken to that psych ward, where he would spike a coffee pot with an entire bottle of LSD. The prison system and the justice system thought that what they had was an unruly kid who'd been lucky to get over a razor wire fence. They didn't much like the inmate. He was troublesome, he used bad language, and he would often not do as he was told. For that, over the years, Mark would be beaten time and again by the guards. He had to escape, that's all he ever thought about. You have to see, in his mind, a mind that worked differently from most people's, he'd only taken his father's tools, and those tools had been given to him. The escapes, to Mark's reasoning, were not crimes, but the right thing to do. He was, in fact, just being very rational. Tools equal mine, imprisonment equals wrong, escape equals right. One day, he was asked if he'd like to join a new woodwork and arts crafts activity. Of course he would. This was a guy that was brilliant at making things, but when Mark saw rolled up copper sheets, the first thing that came to his mind was, they really mustn't want me to stay. That's because what he saw in the workshop were all the necessary bits and pieces to fashion a homemade gun, aka a zip gun. With the copper, he made the gun barrel, and then he fixed that to a homemade pistol grip. When he had the gun ready, the next thing he did was steal an ice pick and take that back to his cell. He took that spike and ripped out one of his back teeth. With blood streaming from his mouth, he called a nurse and he was rushed to the psych ward prison hospital, albeit in handcuffs and leg chains. The dentist knew right away that this was an act of self-mutilation, and that's what he added to his report. After seeing the dentist, Mark asked if he could go for a pee. In the bathroom, he picked his locks again and produced his homemade gun. Pointing his zip gun at the guards, he shouted, "Anybody move and I'll blow your brains out." Some inmates in that ward, perhaps not in good mental shape, started jumping around and screaming. Mark shot a table just to prove to them his gun actually worked. After that, he was gone again, out the door and running through the nearby woods. But again, he just didn't quite know how to stay out. He stole yet another car but was soon caught. He was now making the headlines of local news media. But the prison system, they were starting to get pretty mad at the kid. He'd had his chances, now they wanted him to suffer. And suffer he did, in jail, while the authorities tried to figure out if this kid was mentally fit to stand trial. They kept him locked down for 24 hours a day. Was he fit to stand trial? 4 psychiatrists said no. No way, he's mentally ill. This man doesn't know what's right or wrong. Sure, he understands the court system and he's not raving mad. In fact, he's obviously very talented, but still, he doesn't know why he's here at all. he should not stand trial. One man said that wasn't the case, calling Mark a malingerer, meaning someone pretending to be mentally unwell. That same man decades later changed his mind. That didn't help the 20-year-old Mark, who was sent back to jail. There he made another gun, an improved version of his last zip gun, even though for this one he had to use an empty roll of toothpaste. "I was in my gunsmith phase, I could make a gun out of anything," Mark would later recall. This time he threatened the guards, and just to make sure the gun was working, he fired it at a wall. It was working alright, and many other inmates saw that Mark had not shot anywhere near the guards. But enough was enough. The guards beat Mark within an inch of his life and forced him into a pitch-black cell, naked, bruised, and broken. After 11 days of that, he took a plea deal without really knowing what a plea deal was. For firing at the wall, he was convicted of attempted murder. Later, he was sent to the Florida State Prison, a prison that at the time was said to be totally ungovernable, a prison where violence and murder was commonplace. No inmate in the US ever wanted to end up there. It confined the so-called worst of the worst, but as prisons go, it was the worst of the worst. Mark was still occasionally unruly. He still didn't really understand the prison system or the prison code, and he was beaten severely by both guards and inmates on many occasions, and so he started making homemade weapons. When they were found, he went back into the hole. His solitary confinement was often a life of total isolation. The order given by the prison authorities was no clothes for the prisoner, no mattress or sheets. Conversation with anyone was prohibited, which included prison trustees. He was given no toiletries, no tissues, no toothpaste, no soap. They turned off the water in his cell at times, and he couldn't even flush the toilet. He had to eat with his hands and in the total darkness. The torture and humiliation was later compared to what happened at Guantanamo Bay. He had to live in silence and darkness, naked, like a trapped animal. And if that's not cruel and unusual punishment, then what is? His punishment was nothing short of medieval, and arguably a form of modern-day torture. The prison put him on a consolidated security list, so when he wasn't in total darkness, he still wasn't allowed out of his cell. In his own words, he said, "You can go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years without ever seeing the yard." In total, he had 10 years of requests to see the sun, and they were all denied. But he still caught sight of the guards, and what he would do is study their keys. After examining them, he'd memorize the cuts in the keys and then make his own set out of paper. "I made keys for every lock in America," he said many years later. Did he ever get to use them? Well, Mark attempted to escape 13 times in all, and he was successful 7 times. One time he scaled the fence and broke both his feet. He somehow managed to hotwire a truck, ram a police roadblock, and then after a high-speed chase, ended up driving the truck into someone's living room. They were really upset, he later said, about the people whose house he'd driven into. He had hundreds of disciplinary reports, but he's never hurt anyone else. They were usually for minor infractions, or for being found with weapons he was keeping to protect himself in the ultra-violent places where he was housed. His story became public, and the majority of the public now say that this is a man who has some mental issues, who's been chewed up by the prison system right from the first year when he was brutally beaten and sexually abused by a gang of inmates. He was paroled on February 5, 2019 on the condition that he spend a year in a mental health and substance abuse center. Over the years, he developed dependencies on the many drugs he received in prison. After only a few days, he started showing signs of bipolar mania, and his kidneys were failing him. He also tested positive for methamphetamine. Mark was subsequently sent back to jail, and from what we can now see, he is waiting to see which prison he'll be sent to. It's now 40 years since he drove off with his deceased father's tools. 27 of those years he spent in solitary confinement, either with the absence of the sun or in total darkness. How many people have you killed? An interviewer asks the prisoner known as the Iceman, a one-time altar boy, a family guy, and prolific hitman. An approximate guess? He pauses, then says, more than 100. His face shows no remorse, no sign of emotion, other than perhaps a veiled bitterness aimed at life itself. How do you feel about killing? Asks the interviewer. I don't. It doesn't bother me at all. I don't have a feeling one way or the other. He'd be asked the same question in another interview, and that time he'd reply, nothing haunts me. No murders haunt me. This is the story of Richard Kuklinski, a man associated with frozen water not only for the total lack of feeling or fear that he was known for, but also for the way in which he disposed of many people whose last sight on planet Earth was the Iceman's 6'5", 300-pound body bearing down on them. How did an altar boy turn into America's hitman with the biggest body count? How does one become so impassive to murder or other people's pain? Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935. Many years before, he became known to some mobsters as the Devil himself. Kuklinski shared a New Jersey apartment with his Polish-American father and a mother who was born to Irish immigrants. It's a story we all know, the tough neighborhood, the hard-knock life, with his mother eking out her days in a meatpacking factory and his father working on the railroad. From interviews with Kuklinski, an inference we can make by looking at his dysfunctional family, these parents were a long way from the type that would have picked up good parenting guides. It's said the father was a hostile drunk and someone who took sadistic pleasure in beating Kuklinski and his siblings. The mother, who he called an overly strict, God-fearing woman, was no better. In fact, he once called her cancer, saying she destroyed everything she came into touch with. He'd just come in and give you a whooping because he felt like it, Kuklinski said in an interview when talking about his dad. These weren't ordinary beatings, even in a time when a smack on the backside was seen as fair play for parents. No, this maniac of a man was said to have broken household objects while beating his kids. The attacks were so vicious that this resulted in one of Kuklinski's brothers being beaten to death. The parents told the cops he had fallen down the stairs. Shortly after that, the tormented father left the family and never returned. There's no doubt such a childhood had a profound effect on what happened later, with the Iceman's brother Joseph also living a dissolute life that ended with sadism and tragedy. It's a familiar tale in the circles of forensic psychology. The abused children, when no hand is held out to them, turn to hurting and killing themselves. We might also ask if a violent gene is passed on. Perhaps those frontal lobes don't work as other people's work. Perhaps there's no self-control, nurture, nature, or a bit of both. But we'll let you decide later. If you've watched the movie The Iceman, brilliantly played by Michael Shannon in the starring role, you might know a few things about our guy. Like most renditions of reality, it stretches the truth, but it also skirts close at times. Growing up with his mentally impoverished mother, Kuklinski was bullied. He was one of those kids that virtually smelled of victimhood. But he was a big person, and it wouldn't be long until the Iceman-to-be realized that with enough willpower, you can break people, and when broken, they don't bother you again. If you hurt somebody, they'll leave you alone, he told an interviewer once, relating to the time in his teenage years when he made those bullies disappear once and for all. I'd heard it was better to give than to receive, he said, a wicked play on a cliche relating to altruism, not revenge. One time, 6 boys had been beating him. He took the beating, but then went home and found an iron bar. He returned to the group and viciously attacked them. They left him alone. He was right about that. In fact, most people would stay out of his way from then on. If you got in his way, you were going to get hurt. He told the interviewer that even a tiny infraction, someone maybe looked at him the wrong way, and he would beat them mercilessly. Here's the making of a hitman, a nascent killer who would do things most people could never imagine. He was also a pool shark, and it was said that if you bothered him, it would end in tears, blood, or the grave. He murdered at least one person he had called a bully. Speaking of that first murder when he was in his early teens, Kuklinski said in an interview, "I didn't mean to do it, I felt sadness. But after a while I felt something different, some sort of rush. If enemies or perceived enemies weren't around to hurt, it said as a teen he'd take his anger out on the neighborhood cats." But there was another side to him because Kuklinski was fond of women and was said to have been romantic at times. How romantic, how caring is something of a divided issue. The movie portrays him as a loving, doting husband and father. But he already had 2 kids with a much older woman when he met his wife-to-be, Barbara Pedrici. When the film depicts the wonderful early romance, replete with bouquets of flowers and awkward dates, Pedrici would later tell the British press that when she once told him she wasn't ready for a full-on relationship and might want to date others, he jabbed her with the sharp end of a hunting knife. "I felt the blood running down my back," she told the press. Kuklinski then told her in no uncertain terms that she was his forever, and if she left him, she and her entire family were dead. It said he throttled her until she lost consciousness. This is somewhat different from the sweethearts in love we see in the movie. Nonetheless, she would never leave him out of fear or love. Well, that's open to interpretation. They had 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy. The family understood that here was a double personality. They even called him the good Richie and the bad Richie. The good version was a hard-working, committed father who would do anything for his family. The bad version disappeared for weeks on end. He broke noses and handed out black eyes. He even killed one of his daughter's dogs as a punishment because she came home late. This was a man with an almost inhuman rage, but also a man who could be a wonderful father and husband. Soon he was returning home with large amounts of money, which may have helped ameliorate those fears they all had of him flying into dangerous frenzies of anger. Nonetheless, they had barbecues, visited theme parks, made home videos, a lot of home videos, ate turkey at Thanksgiving. They were an average working middle-class American family. Mom's apple pie and church on Sunday. But then more money was coming in, and that's because Kuklinski had started working for the American mob. Apparently, some mob bosses had got the word out that there was a giant Polish-American man in town who showed little or no fear. If you did wrong by him, you lost your teeth or went missing. He was quite the asset for those kinds of people. As the kids were growing up, Kuklinski was taking care of people for the Genovese crime family. He also worked as a human disposal man for Newark's De Cavalcante crime family and the Gambinos of New York City. How did he dispose of people? Well, you name it. He had many methods. He later said in interviews he liked to be creative. One time he bought a crossbow, and because he really wanted to use it, he shot a random guy in the head with it. "I just wanted to see if it would work," he later said in an interview to the consternation of the reporter. He liked to hone his trade, it said, with one author saying murder for Richard became sport. The New York police came to believe that the bums were attacking and killing one another, never suspecting that a full-fledged serial killer from Jersey City was coming over to Manhattan's West Side for the purpose of killing people, to practice and perfect the craft of murder. We can't talk about every hit he did, as that would be tantamount to writing an encyclopedia, but we can discuss some of his more nefarious actions. Well, they were all dark. He told the media later that he enjoyed disposing of people in different ways: ice picks, knives, his hands, hammer, but he liked nothing more than using a nasal spray containing cyanide, not hay fever remedies. It didn't unblock people's noses, it undid their existence. This made less mess. You offed them anywhere you wanted and the cops just thought they had a heart attack victim. When he wasn't leaving bodies in parks or down alleys, he was taking them to a place where he could chop them up and refrigerate the parts. Sometimes he'd just freeze the whole body and then sometime later dump it. This was particularly smart because then the authorities could not determine the time of death, hence the name the Iceman. Although others will tell you he got his name because of his frigid demeanor. There's more ice to this story too. How did Bad Richie know about cyanide? He got this from a man known as Mr. Softy, real name Robert Prong. Prong was ex-military and very familiar with bombs and poisons and guns. He actually drove around in a Mr. Softy ice cream van, hence the nickname. Kuklinski would later recall his friendship with the Hitman, saying he'd go around the neighborhoods and sell ice cream to the kids and maybe kill one of their fathers. But after teaching Kuklinski many methods of murder, Mr. Softy ended up being found in his van, shot several times in the head. Another notch for the Iceman. He did this, police suspect, because he was tying up loose ends. The cops at this time were onto him. It's also said, perhaps not true, that Mr. Softy had offered his services to take out Kuklinski's family, if Kuklinski took out his family. Lots of loose ends could be tied up if there were no families left. We're told that things had started to turn awry. For a long time, the Iceman had been in the services of mob boss Roy DeMeo. DeMeo had not only once handed a beating to Kuklinski, with his cronies of course, and humiliated him on several occasions, but there were rumors DeMeo was beginning to lose it and might end up ratting other mob bosses out. Kuklinski didn't need much encouragement to take his boss out. DeMeo was another victim, or at least this is what police thought. He never actually admitted to that. The movie depicts a couple of instances that are apparently true. One is when DeMeo first met Kuklinski and was impressed at how well he could take a beating. Like a man. We're told Kuklinski was later taken out for a ride in a car, and at some point, the mobster said, "Kill that man over there walking his dog." Kuklinski got out and did it, no problem. Not a big deal. He was hired. But the Polak never had a great relationship with DeMeo. And we might think that he was very happy to get rid of him, if of course he did. Surely he couldn't hide all this killing from his wife. Well, she later said in an interview, "I never questioned him. He would go out at all hours, money would flood in, but she knew better than to be too inquisitive." As for his friends, they all went missing too in the end, except just one according to the Iceman. "Anyone you killed you liked?" asked an interviewer. "All my friends are dead," was his sardonic reply, hinting that he had killed them. It's a long story, but his friends started to know his business, and that was dangerous. He actually did say that there was only one friend he didn't take out, but the rest were fair game. All these tales of gangs and murders often end. People got paranoid and started removing their fears one by one. The mob were doing it and Kuklinski was doing it, but the cops weren't far behind. And when one undercover agent got the Iceman to talk about fast and convenient ways to kill someone over the phone and to sign up for another contract, they swooped in. He was arrested in December of 1986 with many charges, including multiple murders and robbery. He was eventually sentenced to 2 life sentences, getting 30 years for killing a cop. It later turned out he had killed another mob boss too. He ended up in prison on the same wing as his brother, Joey. As we said earlier, Joey Kuklinski had gone the wrong way too. He was serving time for assaulting and then strangling to death a 12-year-old girl. He then threw her off a roof along with her pet dog. Did he regret any of the murders? Well, he usually said no. Then, in one interview, he said perhaps one regret was killing a man who had prayed to God in front of him to save his life. In his own words, Kuklinski said, "So I told him he could have half an hour to pray to God, and if God could come down and change the circumstances, he'd have that time. But God never showed up, and he never changed the circumstances, and that was that. It wasn't too nice. That's one thing. I shouldn't have done that one. I shouldn't have done it that way." His daughter, Marek Kuklinski, later did some interviews with the press, saying the film was not close to reality in terms of their home life. She said she had loved her father and she was shocked to find out he had killed more than 100 people, some say close to 200. The large woman, standing almost 6 feet tall, said she has her dad's ashes. She showed the interviewer a card she had sent to her father while she was in prison. "Remember, Dad, you always left a light on for me. That warm light still shines in my heart," the card reads. "He denied us nothing," she said about her father. "He wanted his life to be like it was on television. He just didn't know how to get there." She said her mother was no angel herself, but her dad could fly into rages and they knew to stay away when that happened. She said he even told the kids once that if he ended up killing their mother in a rage, then he would have to kill them too. She said they knew he wasn't kidding, but he also confided in Marek when she was just a kid. He told her about what happened with his abusive parents, and even told her that he had killed people. "He told me about the time he used a wooden clothing rod to beat to death another teenager who had been bullying him," she said. She concluded, saying she had loved him, but later knew he was a sick, demented man who had been abused and had not come to terms with that. Maybe if he'd gotten treatment, some or all of this could have been prevented. "That thought haunts me every day," she said. During those many prison interviews, Kuklinski seems entirely impassive, smiling and laughing at some murders. But then there's one time when he eventually looks upset, and that's when, once again, he's asked if he regrets anything. "I do want my family to forgive me," he says, and you almost see a tear, some internal emotional distress. "I ain't gonna make this," he adds, meaning maybe he can't carry on with the interview, but he does. You see the Iceman crying, not very macho, but I've heard people that mean everything to me. The only people that meant anything to me. Richard Kuklinski died at age 70 in a prison hospital. He thought he'd been poisoned, although he'd been diagnosed with Kawasaki disease, an inflammation of blood vessels. He had told doctors that they should revive him when he was out, but that didn't happen. His wife Barbara had already signed a do not resuscitate order. February 16, 2003, a small red Peugeot 307 speeds down a frozen Belgium highway. Inside the car are 2 men. One is Leonardo Notarbartolo, a jewel dealer from Italy with an office in Antwerp's diamond district, where 80% of the world's diamonds are bought and sold. Next to Leonardo is his friend, Speedy, a nervous wreck that seems to be on the verge of a panic attack. In the back seat of the small car is a large black trash bag, tied up but full to the point of bursting. The two pull off the highway and onto a lonely dirt road, following it into a thick stand of trees. From this spot, the highway is no more than an echo of occasionally speeding cars. Miles from civilization, the grove of trees is silent between the passing cars, and the duo inside the small Peugeot glance out into the night, listening. Notarbartolo is calmed and collected. Speedy, not so much. Getting out of the car, Notarbartolo tells Speedy to stay put. He's going to have a look around. He walks into the darkness and finds a small pond with a shed beside it, yet no signs of civilization or any recent visitors. The spot seems perfect, nice and remote. Making up his mind, he heads back to his car. Stepping back into the grove of trees, Notarbartolo can't believe his eyes. Speedy is rushing back and forth, trash bag in hand, hurling papers into the bushes and ripping out the videotape from cassette tapes. Israeli and Indian currency floats through the air, scattered everywhere as Speedy rampages in a full-blown nervous breakdown. All around the muddy floor are the specks of tiny glittering diamonds. Speedy and Notarbartolo aren't really gem dealers, they're gem thieves, some of the world's best, and the trash bag whose contents are now scattered all over the forest is the only evidence left linking them to what would be called the diamond heist of the century, with over $100 million in diamonds and jewelry stolen from the world's most secure vault. A year and a half earlier, Notarbartolo is sitting at a cafe, enjoying a break from his fake job as a gem dealer in Antwerp's diamond district. This is the world's epicenter for the diamond trade, and all around Notarbartolo are burly men armed with handguns, wheeling away suitcases full of gems, security personnel driving armored cars full of wealth, and diamond dealers with black briefcases handcuffed to their wrists, imposing bodyguards watching their every move. Customers and sellers from all over the world form a crowd around Notarbartolo, and like a wolf in sheep's clothing, no one has a clue that the world's best thief is sitting in their midst, calmly sipping an espresso. Notarbartolo is in his early 50s, a professional thief for life. Having pulled off dozens of successful heists, he no longer steals because he has to. He does it because he was born to do it. His very first robbery was at age 6. His mother had sent him out to buy milk, but Notarbartolo had found the milkman dozing. Reaching into the dozing milkman's pockets, he fished out 5,000 lira, or about $8, and helped himself to a bottle of milk. When his mother found out, she beat him, but Notarbartolo knew he had found his life's calling. Growing up, he stole from his teachers in elementary school, and when he became a teenager, he started stealing cars and even learned how to pick locks. With a growing reputation, Notarbartolo set his sights on bigger fish, and in his 20s, he started studying people so as to best learn how to rob them. He followed jewelry salesmen around Italy for weeks, observing their every move so he could understand their habits. Then, once he knew his marks' routines better than they did, he struck, making off with loads of precious gems and jewelry. As the master thief entered his 30s, his ambitions grew yet again, and he began assembling teams of professional thieves to tackle ever more difficult and lucrative targets. He would put together lock-picking experts, alarm aces, safecrackers, tunnelers who could penetrate any vault from below, and even a man who could scale the sleek exterior of an office building. Honing their arts and preparing for jobs in Turin, Italy, the group of professional thieves came to be known as the School of Turin. Notarbartolo was the mastermind and specialized in charm. He'd play the part of a jeweler and befriend his marks, often being invited into offices, workshops, or even vault rooms to inspect merchandise. All the while, his mind was furiously making notes of his surroundings, keeping track of the exact number of steps he took so he could figure out size and dimensions of a vault, spotting security devices and any special features that would have to be defeated by his team. Then, a week or a month later, he and his team struck, stealing the entire inventory in the course of a single night. Then one day in his late 40s, as he sipped his espresso in the midst of Antwerp's diamond district, a Jewish gem dealer approached him, sitting down and making an offer. Notarbartolo would be paid 100,000 euros to answer one single question: could the vault in Antwerp Diamond Center be robbed? The answer was an obvious no. Antwerp's Diamond Center vault was the most secure in the world, and Notarbartolo himself kept part of his stash locked up inside it. The vault was 2 floors below the main floor, with a lock that had 100 million possible combinations. Infrared detectors monitored for body heat inside the vault, and heat detectors would trigger an alarm if they detected any rise in ambient temperature, such as the fraction of a degree raise in temperature that a man's warm breath might cause inside the temperature-controlled vault. Doppler radar blasted the inside of the vault, detecting even the most minute of vibrations or movements, and a magnetic field would trigger an alarm if the vault door was opened. Upstairs, a security force was on constant alert, ready to descend with automatic weapons at the first alarm. But for 100,000 euros, Notarbartolo was happy to show his client just how impossible the task really was, and so he armed himself with a tiny pen camera, which he placed in his breast pocket. The small spy camera, capable of taking 100 high-resolution images. Because Notarbartolo rented an office in the Diamond Center and kept his own gems and jewelry in the main safe, he could gain access into the building and even the vault itself, all the while snapping off hundreds of photos. The vault was guarded with a 3-ton steel door with a combination wheel that needed a precise code to open. The door itself was impervious to drilling, rated to withstand 12 hours of non-stop drilling, though the moment a drill touched the metal, a seismic sensor would be triggered, and the security force upstairs would be on its way. On the interior lip of the door and on the inside of the door frame were a pair of metal plates, and when armed, a magnetic field passed between these plates. Any movement of the door would break the field and trigger an alarm. The only way of disarming the field was to input a code in a nearby keypad. The main lock itself needed a nearly impossible-to-duplicate foot-long key to finally grant entry. Cameras covered every inch of the vault inside and out, as well as all the exterior approaches to the building and even the sky above it. 5 months after showing his client the photos and telling him a heist was impossible, Notarbartolo received a call from a blocked number. On the other end of the line was a familiar voice. "Meet me at this address," was all the voice said, and moments later a text with an address appeared on his phone. Later that day, Notarbartolo arrives at an abandoned warehouse well outside of Antwerp, and any prying eyes. The small Jewish gem dealer greets him with a curt nod, and wasting no time, tells him that he wants to introduce him to some people. Inside the empty warehouse is a huge structure covered with black plastic tarps. Curiously, Notarbartolo approaches it, and he and the gem dealer duck under the plastic, and a stunned Notarbartolo finds himself standing in the antechamber to the Diamond Center's vault. It's an exact replica down to every minute detail, carefully reconstructed from his photos. Inside the vault, 3 Italian men are having a quiet conversation and stop talking as soon as the dealer and Notarbartolo approach. The men don't give their real names, instead referring to each other only by nicknames. This way, if one gets caught, he's unable to finger the rest. One of the men introduces himself. He's known as the Genius, and he specializes in alarm systems. Any kind of alarm system. He tells Notarbartolo that he can disable most of the vault's alarms remotely, but some he'll have to do himself. Next, a tall, muscular man shakes Notarbartolo's hand with a firm, almost overpowering grip. The others call him Monster, and tell Notarbartolo that they call him that because he's monstrously good at everything, but also because of his huge physical strength and intimidating demeanor. Behind the Genius and the Monster, a small, unassuming older man quietly waits for his introduction, calling himself the King of Keys. He has a kind, grandfatherly demeanor to him, and his job will be to duplicate the foot-long vault key that's supposed to be impossible to duplicate. He tells Notarbartolo that all he'll need is a clear video of the key, and he'll handle the rest. Notarbartolo tells him that getting a video of the well-guarded key won't be easy, but the king simply shrugs his shoulders and tells him that that's his problem. The team is in place, the target has been chosen, and in a few weeks the monthly De Beers shipment of diamonds will be trucked in and stored inside the vault, up to $100 million in precious stones ready to be plundered. The day is Friday, February 14th, one day before the heist. Notarbartolo is buzzed into the vault alone, and though a camera watches his every move, the security guard on the other end has become accustomed to Notarbartolo's comings and goings to access his safe deposit boxes. As he approaches his deposit box though, Notarbartolo takes one quick step to his left and pulls out a small aerosol can of women's hairspray, covering the interior heat and motion sensor with a coat of transparent, oily mist. The oily film will block the sensor's ability to read fluctuations in the room's temperature, and the alarm it was connected to would only go off if it sensed both heat and motion. Yet nobody knew just how long the trick would actually work, and it needed to last long enough for the monster to later enter the vault and install the sensor bypass. The crew thinks he may have 5 total minutes before his body heat is detected, but nobody is really sure. Later that night, the Diamond District is deserted, save for the permanent police on station 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Notarbartolo drives in a rented Peugeot 307 on a road that skirts the edge of the district, and pulling to the curb, the Monster, the Genius, the King of Keys, and Speedy exit carrying large duffel bags. The rest of the team isn't happy about Speedy being on the job, but Notarbartolo vouches for his lifelong friend. Still, Speedy has a reputation for breaking down toward the end of a job and getting far too nervous for his or the team's own good. Nevertheless, the team accepts him on Notarbartolo's word, though the Monster keeps a very close eye on him. Picking the lock on a rundown office building, the team slips inside undetected. At the rear of the building, they exit out into a private garden that rests up against the back of the Diamond Center and is one of the few places in or near the district that isn't under constant surveillance. Using a ladder that he'd previously hidden there, the Genius climbs up to a small terrace on the second floor of the Diamond Center. There, an infrared detector is alert for intruders, but using a polyester shield, the Genius slowly moves his way to the sensor and finally puts his shield directly in front of it, disabling the sensor. The rest of the team climbs up, and the Genius disables an alarm sensor on one of the balcony's windows, like it's child's play, opening the window wide enough for the team to then drop into a stairwell. They're now inside the Diamond Center, with a fully staffed security force just a floor above them. Descending the stairs, the team enters the vault's antechamber and covers the security cameras with black plastic bags before flipping on the lights. For anyone watching, the lights would appear to still be off. Approaching the massive vault door, the genius pulls out a custom-made slab of rigid aluminum and affixes heavy-duty double-sided tape on one side of the slab, then sticks it to the two metal plates that regulate the magnetic field on the right side of the vault door. Next, he unscrews the bolts that hold the magnetic plates to the door and the door's frame. And, with the sticky tape attached to the aluminum slab holding the two plates together, he simply removes them from the door and tapes them to the wall. The magnetic field still thrums between the two stuck-together plates, but now the door is no longer protected. The King of Keys is up next, and he moves to finish the copy of the vault key that he's made from Notarbartolo's videos. But then he freezes, a thought striking him. In Notarbartolo's videos, the guards almost always visited a nearby utility room before opening the vault. And working off his hunch, the thieves break into and search the room to reveal the original vault key hanging inside. Grabbing the original key, the king slides it into place and the genius dials the lock's combination, also gleaned from watching Notarbartolo's very detailed videos. The tumblers fall into place with the final click and the team holds its breath. The door is unlocked. With a nod, the genius motions to the monster, who turns off the lights. A light detector in the vault could be triggered when the door was opened if not. In the pitch dark, the King of Keys turns the key and spins the handle, swinging open the giant metal door. As the door opens, Speedy rushes back up the stairs so he can call Notarbartolo on his cell phone, saying simply, "We're in," and hanging up. Sitting outside in the rented Peugeot, Notarbartolo watches the front of the Diamond Center. The police scanner on his dash is quiet, and there's no sign of activity within or outside the district. Inside the vault's antechamber, the King of Keys picks the lock on the metal grate that is the last remaining barrier between the team and the interior of the vault. The monster grabs two paint cans from the utility room and wedges them into place to hold the metal grate open. Then the large man takes a deep breath, focuses on his heartbeat and his breathing, working to control both. The heat sensor that Notarbartolo had covered with hairspray earlier in the day is still operational, and though heavily muted, it will eventually pick up the monster's body heat through the oily film. He has to control his heartbeat and his breathing both if his body is already projecting heat to the temperature-controlled vault, and if he doesn't carefully control himself, his body would generate even greater amounts of heat. Having practiced the operation hundreds of times in the warehouse, the monster carefully enters the pitch-black vault and moves exactly 11 steps into the middle of the room, reaching for the ceiling and pushing back a panel. Inside, he feels the security system's main inbound and outbound wires. Along these wires, an electronic pulse shoots constantly in and out of the vault. If any of the sensors were tripped, the circuit would break. As the pulse came into the room, it expected an answering pulse, and if it didn't get one, it would activate the alarm. Reaching in the pitch black, the monster uses a tool to very carefully strip the plastic coating from the wires. He's working with his hands above his head, the stress of maintaining this position causing his muscles to tremble. Any slip of the knife into the actual wiring would instantly break the circuit and trip the alarm. To make matters worse, the strain is causing him to sweat, which is increasing his body temperature. The team thought the heat sensor could be fooled for 5 minutes maximum, but nobody really knows for sure. With the copper wires exposed, the monster clips a new pre-cut piece of wire between the inbound and outbound cables, effectively creating a bridge that reroutes the incoming electric pulse to the outbound wire before it ever reaches the sensors. The monster has done it. The room is now completely cut off from the outside world. Taking no chances, the team immediately goes to work, covering up the heat and motion detector with a styrofoam box and light detector with tape. The King of Keys then takes a handmade, hand-cranked drill out of his bag and gets to work on the locks to the individual storage boxes. A power tool would be faster, but it would also make a great deal of noise. 3 minutes later, the lock breaks and the box snaps open, revealing the priceless gems and diamonds inside. The team has memorized every single detail of the vault and work in complete darkness, not willing to risk setting off the light detector. They turn their flashlights on only for brief moments as they reposition the drill on the next box, working in complete silence. Their bags, meanwhile, are filling with gold bars, diamonds, gems, and millions in various foreign currencies. By 5:30 a.m., the team has been inside the vault for 6 hours, and their bags are filled to bursting. 109 boxes have been opened out of 160, and yet even though the world has no idea the men are inside the vault, they need to leave, now, before the streets start filling with people. Speedy rushes back up the stairwell to call Notarbartolo, telling him that they're on the way out. Loaded with loot, it takes the team an hour to carry the duffel bags up the stairs, bypassing the infrared sensor, lowering the bags down the ladder, and make their way through the abandoned office building to Notarbartolo's car. Gathering in Notarbartolo's apartment, the team cheers. The heist is complete and nobody will have a clue until Monday morning when the dealers return to work. The bags are filled with currency and smaller stones, but the real loot is in the black leather satchels that the diamond dealers keep their diamonds in. The monster reaches inside a duffel bag and whips out one of the satchels, unzipping it, to discover it's empty. Bewildered, he takes out another satchel and another, but they're all empty. Rifling through the satchels and the other duffel bags, the team finds that most of them are empty. The diamonds, which should have been there, are almost all gone. "We've been set up," says Notarbartolo. The team makes salami sandwiches in the kitchen and discuss their situation. The satchels should have been full of diamonds from the De Beers shipment, and they should have earned a total take of over $100 million. Now they're looking at only a fraction of that, about $20 million. A thought struck Notarbartolo. Maybe the dealer had set them up. Perhaps he had planned this with the rest of the dealers and pulled their inventories out of the vault just before the heist, so that when the robbery was discovered, they could claim the diamonds had been stolen and collect insurance money for the stones that they would all then secretly sell later. For the team, it didn't matter. If they'd been set up, they would never find the dealer again, and at least there was still $20 million in loot to split. 2 days later, the team had already gone their separate ways, and Notarbartolo and Speedy were on the highway on their way back to Turin, Italy. In the backseat of the car is the black plastic bag full of the only evidence linking them to the crime. Next to him, Speedy is melting down. The setup was more than he could take, and the normally nervous Speedy is now in full-blown panic mode. He can't go any further with the bag of evidence in the car with him, and he tells Notarbartolo to pull off onto a lonely country road. It's perfect, he says, and reluctantly Notarbartolo agrees. This is where they'll burn the trash, erasing all evidence linking them to the crime. When Notarbartolo returns from inspecting the burning location, he finds Speedy having a full-blown panic attack. There's trash and currency everywhere, and small diamond stones glitter in the mud. Enraged, Notarbartolo orders Speedy to calm down, and the two spend hours picking up any incriminating evidence, leaving the rest scattered about the grove of trees, looking like nothing more than trash. In the weeks that followed, a local farmer would discover the trash and, believing it was a bunch of kids dumping on his property, notify the police. When he discovered even more bundles of trash, he grew incensed and called the police back. This time, they had him list the pieces of trash he found, and when the farmer mentioned a diamond center envelope, the police immediately took interest in this seemingly random pile of trash. An invoice for a low-light surveillance system bearing Notarbartolo's name, as well as DNA evidence from a discarded bit of salami sandwich, would go on to incriminate the professional jewel thief, who would be charged with leading the team of thieves in the vault heist. Sentenced to 10 years in prison, he was let off on parole early, and today is a free man, under very careful scrutiny. As far as the Jewish gem dealer who ordered the heist, when the team went up to meet up with him at their designated rendezvous point to split their loot, he never showed. Notarbartolo claims that the team was played, but the police believe that the entire story of a Jewish gem dealer was a story made to cover up for the fact that the heist was actually orchestrated by the Italian mafia, given that Notarbartolo's own cousin was at the time slated to become the head of the Italian crime syndicate. The stolen gems, however, were never recovered, and the identity of the alleged Jewish dealer who orchestrated the entire plan or his motivations have never been discovered. Was the heist really a setup for insurance fraud? What do you think really happened? Also, make sure you check out our other video, Thief Who Hijacked a Plane and Stole $1 Million. See you next time.